All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the last day of the Road to Equal Justice in Baltimore. I'm Tim Receiver. I'm the Director of Programs at PeaceTech Lab. And I mentioned this last week, but we are launching the Road to Equal Justice in 16 cities across the United States to help organizations apply media, data, and technology to racial justice issues, to social justice issues. And we are proud to make Baltimore our first stop. So thanks again for your participation and for your engagement and your questions over the last couple of weeks. The last two sessions, we've been looking at platforms that are collecting and visualizing data on racial justice issues. The first week we looked at Ruby Zhang was here to talk about the Opportunity Atlas and how you could go block to block in Baltimore and see the racial justice and economic breakdown, racial and economic breakdown in each neighborhood that is based off census and IRS data. Last week, we worked a lot on training on different tools, from media to data analysis and visualization to understanding your risk online. I don't know if you received this. I sent around a list on Wednesday with all those sessions and the tools and the links to the videos so you could watch those if you missed anything. We have a lot of great sessions lined up for today. Felix Gilbert from Fearless in Baltimore will be showcasing racial justice projects they have implemented and how technology is factored into each one, as well as how to integrate technology into your organization as we talk about grants program today. Dan Hymowitz from the Baltimore's Mayor's Office of Performance and Innovation discusses how his office has been tackling inequalities in 311 responses and conducting outreach on criminal justice reform. We're also excited to welcome leaders of A Beautiful Struggle back today after a great session with Davon Love 2 weeks ago. Davon's colleague, Lawrence Grandpre, will be here today to discuss some big issues around economic equality and criminal justice reform. First up today, we have Gbenga Ajilore, a senior economist at the Center for American Progress, who will be presenting data and metrics around racial disparities in the labor market, both historically and during this last year with COVID-19. Before welcoming Gbenga to the stage, I wanted to briefly tell you about the grants program we are launching at the end of today. We are starting with 3 $2,000 grants. And in addition, PeaceTech Lab will also sponsor software licenses for things like Microsoft Office, visualization software that we saw last week, online fundraising tools, graphic design, data analysis tools, things like that. We have made the process very easy, a very simple form with just a few fields to fill out. The form will open at the end of today, and the process itself will end on November 13th, and you'll hear back from us by November 20th. Just a few quick rules on that. Applications must come from a Baltimore-based organization. Proposed projects should apply media, data, and technology to address racial justice issues, preferably in Baltimore. Proposed projects can be a new idea or expand on an existing project with media, data, and technology tools. You can apply for both the grant and the software licenses. And just to be aware that we are limited on funds. We're trying to get more now to expand out this program, but just because you submit one doesn't guarantee your organization will receive one. A reminder before we get started today, we want to hear from you. So if you want to ask our speakers a question, please post it in the Q&A pod. There's a special Q&A pod below, and we'll get to those and would love for you to ask those directly to the speakers. So with that, we welcome Gbenga Ajilore from the Center for American Progress. Welcome to the Road to Equal Justice, sir.
Thank you, Tim. And I want to thank the PeaceTech Lab for inviting me and thank everyone in the audience for listening. So I would like to speak briefly about how structural racism in this economy has made it such that we have gaps in unemployment and what has created these gaps. But more broadly, given this pandemic, I think it's vitally important to connect the racial justice movement that we've seen during this pandemic in the aftermath of George Floyd's protest with the downturn in many of the communities that we faced and felt. I want to start by talking about the Black-white unemployment gap. There's other gaps between Latinx and Asians and Native Americans and whites, but I want to focus specifically on the Black-white unemployment gap. In theory, this shouldn't exist. The unemployment rate should not be different, whether you're Black, white, Asian, Indigenous, Latinx, whatever. Your employment status should not be a function of your race or ethnicity, or frankly, any other demographic. But I'm going to show you a figure. One moment. So as you can see here, what this is the black-white unemployment gap. And this shows the ratio of the Black unemployment rate to the white unemployment rate. And this starts in January of 1972 when they first started disaggregating unemployment by race. And so what it shows that the orange line is when the Black unemployment rate is twice the white unemployment rate. And so you can see through all the last 50 years that it's been basically double. Now, towards the end of the figure, you'll see that below, there's a point where it drops below, and that was the Great Recession. So what that says during the Great Recession, that everyone was losing their jobs and that white people were losing their jobs faster than Black people. But we have through good economies, through poor economies, that it's always been twice the rate. So this is like this persistent, consistent ratio has occurred. And so the question is, well, why is that? And so it has to be because of structural racism. Structural racism in a form of employment discrimination, this happens where you think about the phenomena first fired and last hired. Even, you see there's been a lot of research about people with the same resumes, but if you change the name, you're more likely to get callbacks, you're more likely to get interviews if you have a white sounding name versus a Black sounding name. And so that's one of the things that we see a lot of times in employment discrimination. The other form of structural racism is mass incarceration. And one of the things that we know is that when people have been through the criminal justice system, this diminishes their success in the labor market, that people who have a record are less likely to get hired and have difficulties in gaining employment. And so we know because of the war on drugs and other things like that, that this increased police presence in communities of color have had an adverse impact in the labor market. Now, this is over the last 50 years, and this goes through 2019. We look at what's happened during the pandemic. In April, we had a huge loss of employment. And one of the things that you notice in this figure, what it shows is that the gap actually closed and that so many people had lost their jobs that the Black-white unemployment ratio went down to almost 1. Now, what happened subsequently, each month later, and you can see kind of like in steps, that the ratio kind of went back to 2 to 1. And so what that tells us is almost like an equilibrium outcome of the labor market, that the structures in place make it so that there's going to be that 2 to 1 ratio in the Black-white unemployment rate. And again, it goes back to the concept of employment discrimination. It goes back to the concept of what's happening with mass incarceration and things like that. And so this is some of the things that make it difficult for communities and people in certain parts of the community to be able to experience upward mobility. Let me go back. Let me finish. About that. So what are the solutions? So we know there's a problem and we know it's structural racism. And so there's 3 things I want to talk about in terms of solutions. So first is strengthening worker power. One of the things that we've seen is a decrease in unionization over the last 50 years and a lack of collective bargaining rights. When you have worker power, when you have unionization, that helps people maintain jobs. It also helps provide pathways to jobs that have upward mobility and things like that. Second thing we could do is actually to combat employment discrimination is beef up the resources of our agencies like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So increase staff, increase budget, put more money into enforcement so that when we do find employment discrimination, we can combat it, tackle it, and punish those companies that are engaged in that. And then finally, we must take steps that we're already doing, but we need to go further to decrease mass incarceration, but also reduce the barriers for returning citizens. So one of it is we want to decrease people going into the system, but then people that have been into the system, we want to make it easier for them to come back. So things like making them eligible for Pell Grants, ban the box policies that where employers can ask you about whether you've been incarcerated or not. And I really want to emphasize this last one because this is what ties racial justice with economic justice. A lot of times when we had, during this pandemic, when we had the George Floyd protest, a lot of the discussion about racial justice was separate from what was happening in the economy. But I argue that these things are inextricably linked, that the factors that impact racial justice, so structural racism, things like that, increased police presence, are the same things that impact economic mobility and economic justice. And so our goal and what we should push for is to tackle structural racism, because not only would that solve the problems of racial justice, but it will also solve the problems of economic justice and create greater, more dynamic, and more vibrant growth in our economy. Thank you. Look forward to any questions you have.
All right, thank you, Gbenga. Anybody, do you have questions around this issue? All right, well, I don't see any questions. I appreciate your time and thanks for joining us live this morning.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, very, very interesting project, and the data that you presented is giving us all definitely food for thought to start our day. All right, thank you, sir. All right, next up we have Felix Gilbert from Fearless right here in Baltimore. He's a design thinker and is here to tell us about a few of the racial justice projects they've implemented and how technology is factored into each one. In addition, he's going to be talking about, how to think about integrating technology into your organization. I know a lot of these tech, you're using technology already, but there are things you would like to be doing, and this is just a way to think about that. So if I feel like you're in here, if you want to go ahead and, oh, there you are. Hey, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
How you doing?
Good. How's it going, everybody? I hope you are all doing well. As Tim mentioned, my name is Felix Gilbert. I'm actually a little dual-hatted. So I am a product designer / project manager at Fearless. So we are a software development shop here in Baltimore. I'm also the owner of Excel, which is a full-service human-centered design agency that Fearless has actually also been helping to groom. I've had the company for a number of years, and then I've been kind of sitting under Fearless's mentorship for a while as we are growing. So you're going to see a few different things where there's a couple things I'll be talking from the Fearless, but then you'll also see Excel's brand a little bit as we kind of talk through a lot of the work that we've been doing here in the city. So as I start off, I'm not sure if everybody has access or if everybody's able to see my screen, but I will be talking through a slide deck that I'll show. In addition, I'm not sure if people are able to, if I share a link, if people could get that as well. So I'm actually going to just put the link in the chat for those that are able to. Hopefully we are, because I would like to make this a little bit more interactive. If not, it's okay. I can kind of talk through some of the steps. So I'm going to throw this in chat real quick. All right, awesome. Okay, so for those that are able to through chat, I just shot a link. You don't have to go there just yet, but we're going to go through when we start kind of making things a little bit more interactive. We're going to dive in there. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll kind of kickstart from here. Let me let's do this here. All right. And I hope everybody had a great day today as we begin to dive in. Okay, so Tim and everybody, can you all see my screen here?
We can.
Okay, awesome. And are we able to hear anybody else, or is it just us like as presenters? And I'll throw that question one more time just in case you guys answered it. Are we able to hear the participants, or is it mainly just us?
Yeah, we can turn them on so they can ask directly.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's dive through. Let's talk about design thinking, right? What is it, right? Like when you hear this term, what is it? How can you use it? And what are ways that you can help change the dynamic of an organization, right? Whether it's a nonprofit, a corporate, organization, whatever. How can you use design thinking to solve big problems? That's what the goal of this workshop is today. So we've carved out about an hour of time for us to kind of dive through this. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing is going to be very brief, very kind of quick. So because I want to spend more time and meat on, hey, how do you implement this? Right. So there's many workshops, there's many tools and ways that you could go about solving complex problems in the workplace. So what I'll be doing today is try to focus on one or two, right? Depending on how things go. I know we're all remote today, so we'll see how things go. All right, so let's kick it off here. And actually looks like I lost my screen. Okay, so I'm gonna just briefly talk about Excel, right? So at Excel, we're all about creating experiences that inspire, right? And what does that mean, right? So as with my company, we're all about, hey, how can we inspire this person, this business owner, to now change the way that he does business? How can we inspire this end user who's interacting with this map to now say, hey, now I have the resources and tools I need to now put food on the table, right? When we talk about creating experiences that inspire, if you think about it through this lens of, hey, we're not just like the guys that make things look pretty. When most people think design, they're like, oh, it's the graphic designer that'll make something look pretty. We go beyond that. So we are the people behind the scenes that are actually building software, right? So when you think about software, I'm talking about like building your Gmails, building your Slacks, your Zooms, your mapping applications, your Zillow, like different types of applications that you use on a daily basis. We're those guys, right? We're not also, we don't just also say like, hey, we focus on mobile app development. We are the team behind the scenes that's powering a lot of things behind the scenes. So we're doing things with the federal government, local, state, as well as nonprofit. So at Fearless, we're working with SBA.gov on their Hubzone program, on a lot of the initiatives they're building out for small businesses. We're doing work with the DoD, with CMS helping transform the way healthcare operates and how they build software for the Medicare and Medicaid community. We're all over, right? Building a lot of tools here. One of those projects that you'll get a quick sample of today is a project that we built out for Return Home. So when you talk about what we do, right, we're all about using strategy, design, development, and consulting. That's what we bring to the table, right? We are heavy on human-centered design, which is what we're going to dive into today to understand what is that. When you hear that term, what is it? What does it mean? And how do you bring that into your organization? So we're going to talk about how you can bring human-centered design and design thinking into your organization, right? So when you talk about design, like I mentioned, so we're the guys that are doing a lot of strategy, a lot of groundbreaking work to say, hey, what are the tools, the systems and tools this organization uses today? And how can we set your company up for success, right? And bring in sustainable software. You see, because at both Fearless and Excel, like we're passionate about people, right? So we're not the team that's saying, hey, we're gonna go build the next Lime scooter app. Like that's not us. We're saying, hey, we want to bring and build software that impacts people, right? And it helps their lives be, improve. Many of you are familiar with the cybersecurity hack that Baltimore went through last year and all of the impact that had, right? All of a sudden, at the end of the day, people were struggling just to pay their bills, right? And that shouldn't be the case, right? With the way technology is today, I should be able to go in there and just easily pay my water bill, electric bill, what have you, and not run into, oh, well, I got to go stand in a line to go pay a bill that I should be able to pay online, right? Like we want to simplify that workflow and improve people's lives so that at the end of the day, they could then go back and focus on their family, right? And build up a strong, healthy family. That's what we're passionate about. So let's talk about design thinking a little bit, right? So when you think about design thinking, I have this graphic here, which on the left side, it talks about having an idea, building upon that idea, launching it and learning, right? So many times in so many organizations, I'm sure many of you on this call may have experienced this where it's like, okay, we got this idea, now let's go build it. How long is it gonna take? 8 months, a year, 2 years, however long that initiative is. Oftentimes what happens is that team is in a dark room somewhere building and creating that thing, and then they go and launch it, right? And then what happens post-launch, oftentimes you find people are frustrated. And like the end user is frustrated, the staff are frustrated because they're like, man, this system or tool or thing that we built, it actually doesn't do what we need it to do. It's broken, or I hate it, right? You find that all the time. And I'm sure if you kind of even think within your own organization or the own tools you use, I'm sure there's processes and tools that you'll find frustrating because you're like, man, if we could only do this, or if this piece of this spreadsheet could do this thing, oh, it would improve my workflow or my process. The difference in what we're talking about today is a little bit of a hybrid of design thinking and agile development. You see, the way that we build software is every 2 weeks, we're delivering something, and we have an idea, we build upon it, we launch it, and then we immediately start testing and learning. Hey, did it work? Did we meet the mark? Where did we fall short? Okay, it did, but we need to improve these pieces. And then we go back to the table and we continuously, iteratively build this software platform or service, whatever we're building, to make sure that it's focused, laser focused now on the end user at hand. And that's where design thinking comes into play. Design thinking is all about a way of thinking. It's a philosophy, right? It's how a different way of thinking, bringing in the right tools to the table, all the way, as well as like bringing a problem to typically like a complex problem. And when you bring all three of those together, it helps you solution and bring a solution to complex problems. And that's where design thinking comes in is, okay, we have this huge complex problem. Okay, how do we reduce the recidivism rate in Baltimore? That's a huge complex problem. Design thinking is, okay, let's think about that differently. Let's change our approach. How can we think about this differently? And then we attack and execute, right? And the way you would also attack and execute is you take it in small, big chunks, or small chunks. You don't say, oh, we're going to go attack it tomorrow. Hurrah, let's go, right? You take small, itty bitty approaches to that to make sure, hey, is what we're doing, are we going to be successful? Or, you know, are we going to run into roadblocks or challenges? You test your assumptions the entire way to make sure you're going to hit the mark versus, oh, we got someplace, but it's not where we wanted to be. Now, let's talk about this a little bit, right? So human-centered design, when I talk about it and we talk about designing for people, designing for humans at their core. So this is a project here that I'm going to dive into a little bit called Return Home. So it's been a pet project of mine, one that is near and dear to my heart, as I've been working with Return Home for the past year. We just launched this website in August of this year. So you can visit it at returnhome.org. Hopefully not during our session, but after. But the challenge here was, okay, we have multiple organizations within the state that work with returning citizens. You've got the Department of Parole and Probations, you got the U.S. Justice Department, and many, 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 many resource providers throughout the entire city. However, when a person is returning home from jail or prison, they oftentimes have different experiences. Some the same. Some may have the same type of experiences, others may not, right? Based off of when they get out or the location they got out of, the availability of their parole officer, their transportation, their living situation. There's so many different factors. So the challenge we faced was, okay, how do we get returning citizens to a sustained level of living, right? The whole goal of it was we want to help people reconnect, rebuild, and actually, I'm actually butchering a little bit. Reconnect, rebuild, and I'm forgetting the third one. It's escaping me. But the goal of it was really, how can we get them back to living a sustained life quickly, right? And get people off of their feet so that their family could get sustained, that they could get their job, their housing, their education resources, and really rebuild, right, their life. So when you look at this problem set for human-centered design, how do you design a product for people that are incarcerated when you can't even get into the facility, right? For human-centered design, it's all about understanding the user, meeting with that user, and making sure you're designing for that user, right? So this was one of the challenges. So we took that, how might we approach to designing this website? Now, when you look at it at its core, it's all about empathy. When you look at human-centered design, it's about creating and building empathy for the end user at hand, right? And that's why we say like, hey, there is no tool that matches, or you can't just pull Microsoft Word off of the shelf and say, yeah, this is going to solve my problem. You can't just say PowerPoint's going to solve it, or you know, I'm going to use Power BI or ServiceNow or some other, you know, tool, right? Like any nonprofit tool or anything out there. It's tough when you just say, I'm going to just grab a thing and it's going to solve my problem, because oftentimes that tool was set to solve a specific problem. Oftentimes it's not the problem or need that your organization has, which is where oftentimes a lot of custom solutions come into play of, hey, how might we decrease the recidivism rate in Baltimore? Or, hey, I've got X amount of beds in my organization because we're a transitional housing facility. How can I let others know that I've got these 100 beds available? How do we solve for that, right? And it all starts at, number one, getting to know the user and building empathy, right? I've been involved in many nonprofit organizations where oftentimes we have a thing. We know that we are a homeless shelter, right? This is who we are. And let's say this homeless shelter wants to build a new facility. I'm gonna just kind of throw that out there. The challenge is most organizations, they know this is what we wanna do. And they say, we're gonna go build this and we're just gonna go implement. However, most times when you're starting a project like that, you need to talk to the community. Hey, community, are you okay with this? Hey, community, we're gonna bring this to your area. Number one, this is the type of traffic that's gonna be here. Here's the need we see. We wanna serve, we're equipped to serve. Can we come serve, right? Because you don't wanna, at the same time, when you bring in a homeless shelter into a community, you don't wanna frustrate the neighbors without talking to them first, right? You wanna talk to them and say, hey, we see a need. We can feel that need. You also want to talk to the homeless community in that area. Hey, we see a need, guys. If you had this, would this help you, right? If we had these kind of workshops or classes, would that help you get off the street? What do you know, if it's 5 degrees below, do you need a place to stay, right? And you're just having the conversations to help solve those needs. So this is where I talk about, like, you can't just slap other solutions just to fix your problem. Oftentimes you got to do the work. You got to do the hard work behind the scenes on how do we solve for this thing. And we're going to dive into some of that here in a bit. So Return Home. So this is the Return Home website that we built. And at its core, the goal was to get the proper resources to returning citizens. Job training, housing, education, government IDs, mental health, all the above, right? And when you look at it, relatively straightforward. But one of the challenges we ran into, I'm going to take government IDs, for example. How in the world do you simplify the government ID process and way of obtaining a government ID? How do you help somebody or teach somebody how to go get their government ID if they have a 3rd grade reading level? Or let's say that they don't know how to read at all. Or you've got a highly educated individual. How do you meet and solve the problem for a wide base, right? So one of the challenges that we took and the approach we took was, okay, let's simplify the verbiage. Let's keep it simple. Let's keep it straightforward. And let's take what the government set up and said, here's how you go get a social security card or a driver's license or a birth certificate. And we dumbed it down and simplified it to that 3rd grade reading level. And then just said, okay, if this is what you need, click here. If this is what you want, click here, go do this thing. Or, okay, if you need a government ID, make sure you have these things, then click here and go, right? Because we wanted to make sure that what we built was able to be used by returning citizens across the board. Not only returning citizens getting out of jail, but their grandmothers, their aunts, their uncles, their family, right? We wanted to make sure, knowing that there's a wide base, we could reach multiple people. And here is just a small story of Ed's story, which Ed is the individual in the background video that you saw. Let me make sure you guys can hear my sound here. Okay, so I'm gonna play this quick clip of Ed's story, and this is one of the ways that we go about building empathy.
The most challenging part of my reentry was finding a place, a comfortable place to live, because I knew that I didn't want to go around my family. Now, I had choices. I didn't want to go around my family because of the different things they were involved in. And not only that, I wouldn't have the comfort level that I thought I needed in order to succeed. So I looked and tried to research different transitional housing. That's all I needed, a job and a comfortable place to stay with a range of support people around me as my cushion and security. A requirement of being there, you had to save 50% of your paycheck. And they checked. And how they checked was you had to get a bank account. And so when you got the bank account, you had to get a bank statement every month. They wanted to see it. They wanted to see what you was doing with your money. Was you saving it? Was you going to spend it, this, that, and other? They can tell. So that's what I did for 1 year. And I got a temporary spot at Hopkins in the linen department. My temp period was about to end. So I had to leave or apply to be permanent. So I applied. They found out my record and they kicked me to the curb. But good thing I had a cushion, and I applied those disciplines that I've learned from beginning of my re-entry in Patrick Aller House by saving. I was able to fall back on my cushion while I looked for something else.
All right. So why did I share that story, right? Why did I share Ed? Ed's story was one that I ended up falling in love with when we met with him. But that comes from the human-centered processes, because how else, well, I as a designer at building a product, let's say even if I was the CEO, if I was never willing to get out of the seat and go talk with my end users, I would never hear Ed's story. With Ed sharing like, hey, at my core, when I got out, I didn't want to go be around my family because I knew what got me where I was in the first place, and I needed to also protect myself, right? So having that level of hearing Ed's story touched my heart personally, right? And it said, okay, how can we continuously improve this process so individuals like Ed can, at the end of the day, get to a successful returning process, right? To where now he has the tools when he's around family or friends, right? Or things of his past, he knows how to continuously remain healthy, right? He also talked about getting his job and how he went about getting the job. Same thing. When you have that level of empathy, when you're building or you're working on a process or a tool, you have that in mind, right? Oftentimes as people on the front lines, we get tired, we get drained because we hear so many different stories all the time, or we're stuck in a process that we may find frustrating. Oftentimes what you got to do is get out the office and just go talk, right? Go have those conversations, because then it reminds you of, that's right, this is why we do what we do. Okay, now I'm re-energized. Let me make sure what we build, I'm thinking of Ed, right? I'm thinking of that person that I just had that conversation with. Because here's what happens. Here's what oftentimes creates those frustrations. So if you can see my screen here, human-centered design focuses on the user, but oftentimes your product, your tool, whatever that, or your team has a different layer, right? There's a layer above that. Above that, you have your organization or your agency or any outside stakeholders. Outside of that, then you have any outside influences, right? And those outside influences could be anything. Sorry, that could be anything. That could be local or state government. That could be, any laws or regulations or anything that could be coming against you as an organization. With those outside influences, oftentimes people are so focused on those externals, or I know my boss could be frustrating to work with. He's a stickler. He or she is a stickler. I've got to go deliver a thing, and I got to get this thing done on time so I don't get in trouble. We're so much oftentimes focused on outside influences that we forget about the actual end user, right? The person at the kind of at the bottom level that we're here to serve. So you got to keep everybody focused there. So oftentimes it's okay, let's turn off the outside influences and focus on the core. Why? Why do we do what we do? What's our why? We remain focused and laser focused there so that we can continue to deliver and meet the user's needs. So we're about to dive into our workshop here. So it's going to get a little interactive. And as a part of that, I got a couple ground rules, right? So I hope you're ready. I hope if you're by your phone or if you're able to get to a computer, please do so because you're going to need to interact. We're going to go through some some sticky note screens here, through a whiteboard exercise. So you're going to need some type of tool to dive in here. So ground rules as we start diving into our workshop and understanding human-centered design. All right. So this is our agreement. I went on and set up the agreements instead of talking to everybody. So our agreement, we agree not to use our devices, watch Netflix, YouTube, pay bills, iron our clothes, or any other random thing, right? Outside of taking care of your kids, like during the workshop exercise, like we got to remain 100% engaged. I know we have limited time here. It's already 10:40 and I want to be respectful of time. Everyone to participate and respect others. Through this exercise, you're going to hear some random stuff that pops up. So please make sure that we respect everybody. Now, once we get into the workshop, if there's questions, I see that we have the question post. So you can post your questions there. We also have a parking lot in the whiteboard tool that we're going to head to. So if you have questions, I'll talk about that, but post them there so that we can make sure we can monitor time. Now, what's our goal? When we dive into this exercise, the goal that I'm going to be walking us all through today and kind of teaching through is, hey, how might we use design thinking to align a group of people towards a singular vision, which is oftentimes a tough task. So how might we handle that? So that's what we'll be walking through today. Now, through this exercise, we're going to do what's called dot voting and card sorting. So we're going to walk through this exercise a little bit. It's a strategy used by multiple companies throughout the world, your Googles, your Microsoft, your Facebooks, Instagrams, all your Apple, all your big tech companies. A lot of innovative companies are using tools like design thinking to help them solve big complex problems, right? Like your Uber, how do I get a car to go pick somebody up at the airport? How can that person knowing or waiting for that car to come pick them up see the car coming to pick them up so that they know where that we responded to their need, right? So those are the kind of problems and things that you typically solve in like a lot of design thinking exercises. However, you can also use all of these in your organization to tackle some of the most difficult and challenging conversations that your organization may face. So there's multiple exercises, as I mentioned, and workshops that you can run through, but we're just going to laser focus on just like one, kind of talk through that a little bit. And then if we have time, we'll squeeze in another one. So let's talk about card sorting and dot voting. So if you are at that link in the chat, please head there now as I start explaining this. So in our card sorting exercise, we're going to walk through an exercise all together and talk about, hey, we've got an end goal. That end goal, I went on and determined and said, hey, this is what we'll focus on. The goal of this is to say, hey, we all, as human beings, we all love to eat. We have to eat to be sustained and to make sure that we could stay alive, right? So what we did was I said, hey, how about we all figure out, it's what, 10:43. I know people woke up at random times. Some people may be hungry, but we know lunch is coming. So let's deal with what most teams struggle with when they're in the office before COVID. What are we eating for lunch? So what are we having for lunch? So we're gonna go through a card sorting exercise, and then we're gonna go through and talk about dot voting, right? And because I'm not gonna come back to the slide deck, I'm gonna just share the next exercise if we're able to get to it. And that is dealing with how might we statements. Right, and a lot of you may find this very intriguing. It doesn't matter if you're in that C-suite level execs, or you're the office assistant, or the front desk person. How might we statements are powerful ways to attack some of the most difficult and challenging pieces that an organization will face on a daily basis. Oftentimes, when we have an idea, we're like, oh, okay, I've got this idea, or we know this problem, let's go fix it. all right, everybody come to the table. Let's figure out ideas. Oftentimes when you come to the table, just trying to brainstorm and figure out how you can attack something, most people already have a set vision in mind, right? When you deal with how might we statements, it helps not only eliminate people from walking in the room with a predetermined way of attacking that solution or problem set. It says, okay, how might we, like you see here on this sticky note, how might we increase revenue using our current product, right? A how might we statement could be of anything, right? You want to also keep it optimistic. For those optimistic thinkers, they're like, yeah, this is great. For those that are like the complete opposite, they're like, this doesn't work. No, we got reality. The reason why you want to keep how might we statements like open-minded and optimistic like that is because when everybody approaches it, it helps you to think differently. And now you're thinking in a more creative mindset of, okay, how can we solve for this thing? Oftentimes this is used in tools like hotels or your Googles. Like for example, a quick example was there was a hotel, I forget the name of the hotel that ran this, but they basically they were trying to improve their housekeeping process. As a part of that, they had a robot that they would deliver, that would go upstairs and deliver towels, linens, toothbrushes, whatever you requested. One of their ways that they approached that was saying, okay, it works, it delivers this thing to the customer. However, they noticed people were a little thrown off by receiving something from a robot. So their approach was, okay, how can we improve the customer's experience when they open their door, their hotel room door, and there's a little robot there with a towel, right? Like, how can we improve that? And one of the ways that they improved that was they said, okay, we could take an iPad and use a little PowerPoint presentation and just make a little smiley face so that when the person opens a door, they get a little ding from the robot, a little phrase that says, hi, I'm your robot, your towel's here. The person picks up their towels. The robot then does like a little dance and says, thank you, and then leaves, right? That way there's just a little bit more joy from the end user. That was one example. Another example for airplanes is how can we improve the customer experience when a person jumps on when they come onto our airplane, right? How do we improve that process? So you can use how might we's all over the place, right? To help solve some of your most challenging or rethink the way that you do business today. So let's all dive over to, I'm gonna stop sharing this screen. Let's dive over to the presentation, or to the slide deck here, and I'm gonna see how many we've got. I see myself so far. Okay, I see a couple. All right, sweet. And I also see a question here. All right, sweet. Okay, so I'll come back to that one. All right, perfect. So I see a couple people here in our slide deck. So let's have some fun here. All right. So I'm going to explain some of the rules here inside the slide deck. So as we start talking about what's for lunch, I'm going to put a time limit. I'm going to give us a couple minutes to jot down some ideas as we start working out what's for lunch. Then we're going to come over. As I mentioned, if you come all the way to the far right of your screen, you're going to see parking lot. This can be for any question, any random idea that you might have. Throw that here in the parking lot. The reason why we have the parking lot is so that we don't have random conversations that end up distracting us from our goal. So this is a way that you can help. All right, you know, those people that love to talk. Hey, have a parking lot. Johnny, put your idea here. I'm not speaking about anybody in the workshop, but like you would say, like, Johnny, put your idea here in the parking lot. We'll address that at the end. So this is a way to help keep the conversation flowing and keeping people focused. All right. So for those of you that are here back on the What's for Lunch tab, if you are brand new to Mural, there is a little off to the far left, there is a notes tag. If you click that, you could get a sticky note. And then you can, once you create your sticky note, you can type whatever you want. And I'll actually create a couple copies here for people that might want to grab one. So feel free just to grab a random one and type away. All right, so I'm gonna go on and we're gonna start off with putting 3 minutes on the clock. And I see Diane asking, how do you type on this? So if you click inside the box, if you click inside the little sticky box and you start typing, it'll show up. All right. And if anybody else has questions, please post it in there. All right. Okay. So I'm going to go on and put a time limit on the box. Whatever you want for lunch. Like, don't hesitate. Don't think about budget. We're talking about what we're eating for lunch as a group, right? So whatever it is you want, however fancy it is, however cheap it is, or whatever you got in the house, let's throw it in here. All right. So I'm gonna put 3 minutes on the clock and let's get started. I'll put some background music as we start working. Also, as you're doing this exercise, whatever is in your mind, just keep dumping it out. It does not matter. You're not limited. All right, we got a little bit over a minute left. All right, so as you start, it looks like people are just about there. I'm gonna bring a couple of these over. Some of these so everybody can see it here. All right, your green, whoever made the green smoothie, I created a card for you, just so you're aware. All right, 3, 2, and 1. Okay. All right, so we are at time. All right, so I'm gonna ask everybody to pause and not add anymore. Now let's go through the next phase, right? So we've got a lot here. So I'm gonna ask for some assistance. I'm actually gonna ask for everybody's assistance. If we could get a little, and this is probably gonna get a little funky because I just asked a wide group for assistance, but it's because I can't interact as easily or kind of call people out. So I'm gonna ask for some assistance to help us now group these together. So we're now looking for like-minded things, right? So I see like a ribs and salad. I see a pizza. I see a burrito. Those clearly don't go together. So if we find food groups, let's put things in like a food group. All right, so let's take another minute or so and put things together in a group. Awesome. Okay, looks like we got some order here. So I'm gonna jump back in here. Okay. All right, so we've got some level of order. So thank you so much to everybody who helped me put some order to this. It was great. So let's talk through this, right? And I'm assuming people you cannot talk back. So I'm gonna try this. If somebody is able to unmute themselves, can somebody just go out and read 2 or 3 categories for me? I'm gonna test it.
And you could raise your hand in Zoom, and then we'll turn on your microphone.
And if it's too problematic, then we may pull back. Okay, I'm gonna go on and just read it. Just for sake of time, I'm gonna just jump through a couple of these, right? So it looks like I see green smoothie, tacos in a smoothie. If I can zoom in, can I not zoom in? I see sushi, Indian food, Ethiopian food, pizza, Cheesecake Factory. Whoever wrote leftovers gonna check the fridge, +1 to you. That is awesome. Coffee, breakfast, burritos, chicken wings, black bean kale, awesome. Mexican food. Is there anything else that we may be missing? Okay, the steak, all right. Ribs and salad, sweet. Okay, so now let's move to the next piece, right? So number 1, we all laid out random ideas. Now it's time to laser focus in a little bit. So this is where it's gonna get a little challenging. So now we're gonna do our dot voting exercise. So in your dot voting, each of you are gonna get 2 votes, 2 votes only. Tim, I'm actually gonna pick on you a little bit and ask you not to vote. The reason why I'm asking you not to vote, or actually, you know what? No, I just saw somebody's name. Tim, I'm taking that away. I'm gonna throw that, I believe I saw Monica Oliver. I believe Monica, yep, Monica. I see that, I saw your icon pop up. I'm gonna designate you as our decider. So I'm gonna ask you not to vote, all right? So everybody else, you get 2 votes. Monica is our decider. So Monica will get 3 votes at the end. So right now she's gonna hold back. She's not gonna vote right now. Everybody else is gonna vote. You get 2 votes. Vote for the main category. So actually, I'm gonna do this. Let's do something real quick. I'm gonna change some of these big ones to, can I change their color? Let's see, I want them, can I not change all your colors at one time? Will you not let me do that? No, I want you to be black. Okay, I'm gonna make these guys black. So the black is basically the card for that category. So only vote on the black card. What, messed that one up. Yeah, don't vote on the smaller ones. When you have your vote, click on the black card only, if that's the category that you want. All right, I think I grabbed each category. Okay. Okay, all right, sweet. Let me grab the tie. Okay, all right, so again, you all get 2 votes each, right? Once that's it, that's all you get. All right, so I'll throw in some more music and you got 2 votes. Use them wisely. You can also vote for your own. All right, here we go. Let's begin voting. I see the visiting koala and visiting shark have 2 votes left. All right, for sake of time, I'm gonna push forward. We'll stop that here. I'll also stop the music. Sweet. We're gonna end our voting. All right, let's see where we ended. Oh, wow. So it looks like tacos and smoothie clearly outvoted. Then we've got the steak, steak frit, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Cheesecake Factory, breakfast, sushi, and green smoothie were all tied for 2. Okay, and then Thai sandwich, they came with 1 vote. Okay, so this might make Monica's decision a little easier. It may not. So Monica, because you get 3 votes, I'm gonna go back and open voting back up and allow you to vote on your 3. Actually, let me make a quick screenshot just so I don't lose this. So I'm gonna let you vote your 3. Traditionally, what happens here, let's say that we had 4 categories that were all very close to each other or tied. The reason why you would have somebody like Monica use her decider vote is she's the one who would help be that tiebreaker, right? So Monica, I'm gonna go on and release you to vote on your 3. You have permission to throw all 3 on one category. It's up to you, all right? So let me make sure you can do this again. All right, and you can vote. And Monica, you just click on the black card to vote. Awesome. Sweet. Thank you. And let's end our voting session here. All right. So from session 2, it looks like you gave a vote to tacos and smoothies. And I'm not sure which other 2, since they all kind of say 1. Monica, are you able to, Tim, are we able to unmute Monica briefly to kind of get where she landed?
1 second.
And Monica, if you're able to just tell us why you voted or what you voted for and why.
I voted for sandwich because and Cheesecake Factory and tacos and smoothie.
Awesome. Okay, sweet. All right, thank you so much. Okay, so knowing that Monica voted for Cheesecake Factory, tacos, smoothie, and sandwich, clearly it sounds like tacos is our big winner, right? Because obviously that's what the group asked for, right? Traditionally, in your dot voting exercise and your card sorting, this is what helps you as a group discover, okay, where should we head as a group? And traditionally what you're doing is you're helping that person that's the decider make the decisions. Traditionally in some groups, and you can flip this up, right? I randomly chose Monica because I saw her name pop up on the screen, right? In most company situations, the decider could be the manager in charge of that project or that department, right? Or that department lead. It could be the CEO, it could be whoever that person is. Unless that person's also open to saying, hey, I'm comfortable with anybody within this room making this decision, right? This person is also, you want this person to traditionally be the person who can help drive that initiative forward. So let's say if we had a big goal, the same exact exercise that we just ran through was to how do we reduce the recidivism rate in Baltimore? And we all threw out a bunch of ideas. That person that's helping to be the decider is to not only say, hey guys, this is the direction we're gonna head in, right? As a group that we all agree we're gonna go in this direction. You traditionally also want that person to be able to have some say and authority to actually make those things happen and remove the roadblocks for the team so that we as an entire team have the road clear to go do what we need to do, right? So that's traditionally how you want to use that, but that person could be anybody in the room, right? So this was one exercise. Now, we focused clearly on what we're going to decide for lunch. Now, I know if we were in the office, this would have been a little bit more interactive, right? And there'll be ideas all over the place. But as you can see, we're all dispersed through COVID. And we all had a bunch of different things in our minds of what we wanted for lunch, but we all landed right into tacos and a smoothie. I don't know who's getting ready to eat that today, So if you have tacos and a smoothie, it looks like the group did their thing. So power to you. Now I want to jump to the next piece, right? Let's talk about how might we, right? Let's try this a little bit. So I'm gonna move. We only got a little bit of, actually, you know what? We only have a little bit of time. I'll briefly talk to how might we, but I'll give room for questions, right? So let me zoom in here. So same concept, right? I'll just, as I mentioned, I'm gonna just talk through this. So we've got your how might we's. So if you're on that board, I'm still there. So when you're looking at how might we statements, as I mentioned, you want them to be big, right? I'm actually also sharing my screen. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna move away from this whiteboard because I feel like it might be a little bit more practical for people to actually see it in action, right? Okay, so I'm gonna move away from my screen. So those of you that are able to see it, you can see my screen. So I'm gonna talk through a couple live examples. So here's example number one. And I'm gonna ask, well, time, I won't have you unmute mics. All right, so example number one. How might we allow a random stranger to share their home so somebody else can stay there? Right? We all know who that is. As we all know, it's Airbnb. Airbnb used design thinking to improve, to solve the situation of how can I allow a random stranger into my house to rent an extra room and feel safe, right? That's where design thinking comes into play. How can we change the game? How can we be innovative? How can we do something different, right? In the book Design Sprint, Jake Knapp talks about, he's a product designer at Google. He talked about being on the Gmail team, right? So those of you that use Gmail, one of their how might we statements was, how might we improve the inbox on Google so that people don't always see a bunch of junk? When they did that, let me see if I could find a quick example. Let me see if I could just get like a quick concept. Yep, right here. Okay, so how might we clean up a person's inbox? Because people's inboxes were getting flushed with all types of random junk and spam. How might we improve their inbox? That's where one of the things that Gmail did was they said, okay, we're gonna have a primary box, promotions, and then you see these other ones like updates, forums, or family. They created custom boxes so that your email can automatically be filtered out. Thus, you can see the information that you're looking for and you don't get your inbox flushed with a bunch of spam, right? So that's another example. Another example here is, I'm not sure how many are you familiar with Slack? So Slack is a communications tool for organizations where you could kind of like a live chat with your colleagues in your organization. So Slack had the same thing of, okay, email, everybody today is emailing each other. How do we get teams away from email? Because oftentimes I would send an email, I would have to wait a couple hours or wait till the next day for Johnny or Samantha to respond to me. So they created Slack so that we could instantly talk to each other and collaborate with each other. So the conversation, their how might we was, how might we improve communication inside of an organization? Then they came up with Slack, right? And in that tool, people are able to collaborate. On top of that, they said, okay, hey, there's all these other tools. How might we improve Slack so that everybody's tools are we can start automating people's workflows? That's when they started saying, okay, we're gonna integrate Zoom and Jira and Word, Microsoft Word and Google Drive and all these other tools and plugins so that it can improve people's workflows, right? And start automating a lot of things for teams, right? Even Blue Bottle Coffee is another one. So in the book, they talk about it a little bit of, okay, hey, we sell coffee. How do we improve the way we sell coffee, right? And through Blue Bottle Coffee, they walk through this exercise, the same type of exercise to figure out how do we market, how do we sell, how do we separate ourselves from established brands like like a Starbucks, like a Dunkin' Donuts, right? As, hey, we are Blue Bottle Coffee. We do things differently, right? So there's a bunch of tools and resources that you can use all throughout to bring design thinking into your organization, right? As I mentioned, you can use this in a plethora of ways. You don't have to limit yourself to a product or a service. It can literally be, hey, how do we bring this new initiative into our organization? How do we change things inside of our organization? And design thinking, as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be limited to the designer or that creative individual. Everybody can use it inside of your organization to help transform the way that you work and operate. So with that, I will end there and I will open the floor for questions if there are any. Let me actually check the parking lot to see if there were any in there. Hey, somebody wants to go to folks' houses for lunch. That is awesome. How might you improve that for that process? I will let you decide. Maybe you should go to a friend's house or your family member's house for lunch. And I ended up creating this one here, the what tools can be used in design thinking. Traditionally, as long as you saw here, we use Mural, but if we were all in the office, we would be using permanent markers, sticky notes, and the little dot voting stickies. So simple tools, right? Like you can use tools like Mural all the time just to get people collaborating. And as you see, because we were dispersed and your mics were muted, it helped us drive forward. But you could use tools like this to help the conversation stay tight and laser focused on the goal in mind. So with that, are there any questions? And I saw somebody asked about the music. It is a Spotify playlist. I will post the link in the chat. For those that are, I think, John, you were interested. It is the Chill Hop Radio playlist I was playing. So I will throw that link in there for you. But I'll throw this out as well. Stanford's design school, they have an article that also talks about the use of music, right? When people are collaborating or they're thinking, it's another way to stimulate people's minds, right? To kind of get them in the mood of, okay, how can I go problem solve? So having nice mellow music behind the scenes is a way to also help stimulate people's minds, and they have no clue, right? I didn't tell you guys I'm playing music to stimulate your mind. I just said I'm trying to set the mood, right? But I knew behind the scenes, I'm actually trying to stimulate the way you think and also make it like a relaxing environment. So that's another tactic you could bring into the office space.
Hey, Felix, I've got a question from Erica who says, you spoke about engaging the end user to stay aligned with mission. Are there examples that come to mind where you've seen organizations go astray in this regard?
Oh, I see it. I see them go astray all the time. That's one of the most challenging pieces, is because oftentimes organizations, they are laser focused on their kind of their mission, their model, or like the product or service that they're providing. And they many times over and over, they forget of their why and why they're doing it. So it's one of those things I often say, companies and organizations have to be intentional about meeting their end users' goals and needs. And it's easy to slip because everybody gets excited about that new thing, right? Or, hey, we're excited about reaching our goal, but why are we doing what we're doing? You have to keep that in the forefront. So there's plenty of companies out there where if you've seen companies that like a clothing line or like a brand, a McDonald's, whoever, oftentimes they may launch something to say, hey, we got this new thing, and that thing may fall to the ground and fail, right? Why did it oftentimes fail? When you dig behind the scenes, you find that, oh, they weren't meeting and talking to their people, right? One of the projects I was close on with SBA, so the Small Business Administration in the federal government, their goal is to help small businesses get the tools and resources they need, like if it's a loan or like a lot of the disaster relief stuff, right? So perfect example, when COVID hit. So when COVID hit, they had the whole disaster loan work process, like the whole loan application process that they needed to get out quickly so that people could go sign up and get the loans that they needed, right? So that they could help with their help with payments and payroll and all the above that all these companies needed. One of the challenges came in the organization that was helping SBA. When it was time to launch, the system broke and it crashed, right? And then we also, Fearless, our team came alongside because we have a strong relationship with SBA. We quickly came in there and helped them revamp it, right? And get it back live, right? So that it's like, all right, sweet, we have this tool, we built it, it's up live, and people are now across the country able to help submit for their loans, right? One of the reasons we were able to get in there quickly and help was because we understood SBA's why. We knew who their target user was, and we didn't have to run through this whole lengthy piece of understanding the user, understanding the base. It was, nope, we see a need, we know exactly what's going on, let's go in there and help, right? I'm thinking of another one is, you guys may not be as familiar with like the Hubzone program because it was one I was on. It was another one where traditionally SBA was so laser focused on the program itself, they forgot about the end users, right? So there was a lot of frustration when laws and regulations came to change the way small businesses could go after government certification. So because of that, we helped SBA again come in and say, nope, you got to focus on your people. Yes, we understand Congress has this mandate, but let's take that mandate, work with Congress, and help Congress at the same time understand, hey, this is what that small business owner in Kansas, this is his struggle. If you take this away, here's what's happening, not only to him, but 800,000 other small businesses around him, right? So we help to paint those pictures so that it remains clear. And Samantha, I hope that answered your question.
No, that's great, Felix. And I've got one final question from John Kern, who says, hi, Felix, have you had the opportunity to do design thinking about city residents interacting with city agencies?
Yes, I have. Through Return Home, actually. So one of the next phases of Return Home is to number one, it was to lay the foundation, but part two of that was to say, okay, now that we have Return Home in place, how might we interact with other organizations right across and other resource providers throughout Baltimore to now say, hey, how can we all collaborate with each other, number one, and then improve the process and the conversation across agencies and end users, so that as an end user, if let's say I got out of jail and I'm looking for a bed somewhere, right? I just got out, I need a place to stay. If we have this platform, some of the conversations we're starting to have is, okay, can I use Return Home as a place to say, all right, hey, Return Home, who has beds available? Oh, these 8 organizations have beds that are available today. Out of these 8, 2 of them are at capacity, right? And then it'll let me see, okay, here's who has beds in my area, who's closest to me. Sweet, let me go connect so I have a place to lay my head at the end of the day. So like we're starting to have some conversations there. Fearless is also having conversations with like the local city as well about like how do we improve like the healthcare and like improving the communication, right, and handoff, because oftentimes what we see is data is bad, right? Everybody has data challenges of like, hey, I've got all these resources, but information's outdated. How do we keep that in up to date so that the end user, when they need that, if they call a 411 or they call a local city office, they actually know who to go to and that information is up to date. We're trying to have those conversations behind the scenes so that we can improve that handoff for the end user when they have a need. They call 411 for whatever. Here's where you need to go, and this is up to date. I hope that answered it, John. And if not, feel free to contact me. My contact information was in the slide deck, but if you have questions, you can reach out to me directly at Felix, Felix, at exceldesigns.com. I'll also throw it in the chat. And I'll also shoot you the Fearless website. So I want to, number one, thank you all for your time. Tim, again, I appreciate it. And I hope this helped just be a small exercise, a small tool you can implement today to help transform your organization.
Yeah, loved it, Felix. Thank you so much for all the wonderful presentation, for the energy you brought, and thank you for all of the work you've done in Return Home. That's such a great program.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Take care.
All right.
And that last question is a really good segue into our next session, which is with Dan Hymowitz from the Mayor's Office of Performance and Innovation, OPI. Dan, would you mind if we've got just a short video to show? Would that be okay?
Sure.
So a couple weeks ago, I watched a movie called Charm City by the director Marilyn Ness, and it was around organizations, police, and government officials, kind of everybody after the death of Freddie Gray. And it was just showing some of the thinking that was going on, some of the new thinking inside of the Baltimore City Council at the time, not advocating any position at all, but it was an interesting exercise to see it on the screen. And it really fits in with the design thinking approach that we just heard from Felix. So John, if you've got that video teed up, could you play that? And this is about a 4-minute video.
The reds are shootings, the blacks are homicides, right? The browns are dirty alleys, the greens are crimes and corporate surfing, narcotics. So every time you see a black, what do you see? You see everything else, right? When you see a red, that's the key, because when, like, look, every time you see all the other stuff, right? So if I were in charge, right, we would basically kind of restructure how it happens. Every police commander would have at least a housing inspector that works directly out of their district, right? They would have a health inspector that works directly out of their district. They would have a DPW crew.
I mean, it makes sense, you know. But again, I think employment development and, you know, job training. I mean, it's all
intertwined.
It's all intertwined, exactly.
Because it's a generational thing. You look at the young man who was killed by the police in Southwest Baltimore last week. His father's doing 50 years for murder right now. What would it look like if we find the sons, the daughters, the cousins, the nephews, or whatever, of perpetrators or victims of violence, and we do family strengthening, economic success programs with their entire family from the time that kid's in kindergarten, 3rd grade, until, like, how would that look? My guess is that we'll have a lot less incidents of violence because they are 50 times more likely to be in that life. So those are the kind of things that we'll be pushing on tomorrow. And then we will get started. Excuse me.
I know it's always not.
Good evening, everyone. Please have your seats. We're going to get started right now. Tonight's hearing is on City Council Resolution 17-002R, Coordinated Agency Violence Reduction Strategy. This resolution is one that I introduced because, as we know, we have a violence epidemic in the city of Baltimore, and for far too long in our city, we have been looking at violence just through the lens of the police department. And we know, and it's been proven, that we were wrong in that. We have been wrong.
So as you can see, these are the number of homicides in the city going back to the year 2000.
A fight is breaking out on an East Baltimore street, but the guys running to intervene are there to de-escalate it. A woman with a shovel is arguing with a man. Someone knocks our camera away, but we still saw the situation brought under control.
The main thing that we did was really cool everybody down. We asked the guy that was involved to just take a ride, just leave.
Alex Long works for Safe Street. His job, and that of his coworkers, is to step in to simmering conflict before violence breaks out. Their results get noticed, considering Baltimore's high rate of violence. In 3 of the areas where the program is working, there hasn't been a fatal shooting in a year. For the 11 News I-Team, I'm Jay Miller.
Alex, how long you been working for State Street now?
About 6 months.
6 months? This shit was right up your alley, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
The only way we gonna get on top of this shooting and stuff, the streets gonna have to cure the streets.
All right, well, thanks for everybody's patience on that. Next, we have Dan Hymowitz. I mentioned from the Mayor's Office of Performance and Innovation. I appreciate you jumping in so quickly. We just asked him last week if he could join us, and he made time for this, so really appreciate it. Dan, in addition to being with the Office of Performance and Innovation, OPI, he was a senior advisor at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and the Tony Blair Africa Governance Initiative, AGI, where he directed the organization's thought leadership, developing and sharing learning from AGI's experience advising presidents and governments in Africa. And he was even working on Ebola response in Liberia back in 2014 and 2015. So with that, welcome, Dan, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. So I put together a few slides, which I'll share my screen, hopefully. Okay. And Tim, just to make sure, is my screen shared? I think it is, but.
Yeah, it looks great.
Great. So thanks everyone. So, you know, that video, that's a tough intro. I mean, that's a tough act to follow. As many folks on the call will be aware, that features the current council president and also the Democratic nominee to be the next mayor of Baltimore. So we'll find out soon whether Brandon Scott will be the new mayor of the city. So I'm speaking on a topic, I hope it's sort of the right one, but we'll see, which is, you know, basically thinking about how we're using data from my office to, you know, really examine, you know, to what extent Baltimore government's city government is delivering city services equitably. So I'm going to share a bit about how we're thinking about that from my office. So first of all, what is my office? The Office of Performance and Innovation has a few different parts, but the two pieces are CityStat and the innovation team. The CityStat part is a kind of a longstanding part of City Hall that you know, is basically an office for the mayor that helps use data to make sure that city agencies are delivering services effectively and efficiently to residents. So we're sort of a performance management unit for the mayor. And then the innovation team is a newer part of city government that was started a couple of years ago in collaboration with Bloomberg Philanthropies, and is a team that's basically there to tackle a big city challenge defined by the mayor using, yes, quantitative data, but also tools like human-centered design. So I'm mainly going to be talking about the work of CityStat right now, and again, this sort of performance monitoring and performance management piece of what we do. So, so just an example of the performance management. This is just a little snapshot for one of the areas that we track as part of our work, city cleanliness. So this is something that for the current mayor, Mayor Jack Young, city cleanliness is a top priority for him. And so, you know, we've developed a system to basically track how well, you know, the city is addressing cleanliness challenges. And this is sort of the framework we use, the different metrics. I'm not going to talk through these all, but this is like an example of what my office does. And we in routine meetings bring in the agencies responsible for this work and, try to understand what's working, what's not, and how to, how the city can do better. That's kind of some of the core work that we do. So now I'm going to get into looking at how we consider issues, around equity and disparity. So this is something that in this clean stat meeting that I just referred to that we kind of discovered. This was back from 2019. So in addition to seeing how efficiently services being delivered, just overall, we started to break down and disaggregate by different parts of the city. And you can see, indeed, there were some pretty alarming disparities, in terms of the efficiency of basic cleanliness services, depending on where you lived in the city. So this is something we identified through this routine monitoring and through the analysis that my team of data analysts, did in this clean stat meeting. And then, so what did we do about it? We worked with the Department of Public Works, which is, one of the primary agencies responsible for this, this aspect of city services, and helped to develop some new tools for them, including some systems to really look at what the individual sanitation teams were doing in a more real-time way than they had previously done. And then I think maybe even more importantly, on the right-hand side of the screen, we developed a new system to deploy the crews to different to different areas of the city. Because one thing we saw in this previous slide was it was actually the system they were using to send crews out to different parts of the city was itself problematic in terms of leading to some of this, partially contributing to this picture that you see on this slide. So this system we helped them to develop was much more based on just where the work was and how to more efficiently go to that work, regardless of, what part of the city it was. And it had a real impact. So, this is a headline from the Baltimore Sun from back in April, that we had, essentially dealt with some of that, that disparity and that overall backlog that we saw in that previous slide, and some of the, systems we use to improve that. That's just a thing related to city cleanliness. We've likewise looked at this related to some of the services that our Department of Transportation delivers. This is a breakdown of, looking at, again, key services that agency delivers by different part of the city, and tried to shine a spotlight on some of the disparities we saw there. Another more current example is, the work we're doing to assess the impact of COVID on communities in the city, and a specific tab of our public dashboard, which really looks at, basically displays very prominently what the disparate impacts of COVID are on, on different groups, again, including race and ethnicity, but also you can see there's a piece in the lower right-hand part of this part of the dashboard that looks at, some of the disparities by gender. So that's like just 3 examples I'm highlighting from my office that, again, we're sort of there to use data to see how the city is doing to deliver services equitably to residents, and some of the ways we're using data to do that. I wanted to end with 2, I think, really important, I would say, challenges or limitations about this, and just really acknowledge those in a very, forefront way. So first of all, the things I showed are pretty, I guess areas where we think we've, at least the data, we've sort of figured out at least how to use the data to kind of assess this. It's not always so straightforward to use data to consider equity for all kinds of city services. So for things like, sanitation, like I showed in the first example, that's pretty clear. But I think when it comes to issues, for example, like policing, I think the notion of equity, it's certainly, you can use data to do it, of course, but it's a lot more of a complicated picture. So it's not just as simple as kind of building a dashboard and putting it out there and moving forward. I think it's quite a more complicated thing, and something we're working on and going to be looking forward to doing more of under the next mayoral administration, which will start in early December. The second bullet I'd say is, I just want to acknowledge what our office does, which is use data to monitor performance, of city government. And you can kind of see that, like, it's one thing, like on this previous slide here, to show these disparities in how COVID is affecting, different, is having disparate impacts based on race and ethnicity. It's a different thing to, like, address it and to make it better. And that's much less straightforward. And that's not something, especially when it comes to COVID, which, is a fast moving, fast evolving challenge that in many ways, I don't think any of us were prepared for. Sort of fixing the picture on this slide is a lot different than just identifying it and using data to tell the story of the challenge. So, I want to acknowledge there's a big gap between, kind of identifying the challenge with data and figuring out how to kind of resolve it or address it in a way that's really meaningful for residents. So those are some of the things that we think about from my office. I think we got a lot more work to do, depending on who our next mayor is. I know this is going to be the issue of equity and how we serve residents equitably is going to be like a really important issue that my office is going to be asked to be doing a lot more to think about. So I will kind of pause there to see what questions there may be, and I might be able to even look at it. Nope, can't click on it while I'm sharing my screen. So I'm going to stop sharing and also kind of pause there to see what kind of questions there are. So Tim, I don't know if you want me to answer the question in the chat box or to kind of pause to see, kind of see what else is, the audience is interested in.
Sure. Yeah, you can go ahead and answer that. And if anybody has any questions, you can either put it in the Q&A pod or raise your hand and we'll call on you. So the question for the first question, Dan, is from Billy Daly, who says, are there specific data sets that would make it easier to analyze the equitable delivery of city services?
Yes, but I think the examples I was sort of highlighting, like policing, where I think the notion of equity is really like complex. I don't think the challenge there is like so much lack of data as much as like really agreeing with residents on what equity would mean, and then we can figure out how to measure it. I do think if I were just giving like one thing, like in terms of like data sets that I think would like really allow us to do so much more on this, would be more systematic, comprehensive surveying of residents, because so much of this could really be spoken to in terms of residents' perceptions and sort of feelings about, especially if we could really do it systematically and comprehensively. That could be a game changer in terms of really developing a new data that could really inform additional ways to look at this beyond just the like 311 data I showed in that the first slide with the city cleanliness. I should have mentioned that's 311 public data. So, but yeah, I think that would be the one thing that jumps to mind is like something that would really be helpful as a new data set.
Yeah, and Billy says that's so interesting. That's a great point, and something that we focused on last week quite a bit is setting up these surveys and what to think about as we're doing that. So Dan, what for since you've had COVID this year, what have been some of the, have you had setbacks with this? Is it delayed anything, the implementation, or?
Tim, could you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, for OPI, how has COVID impacted OPI this year and your activities? I'm sure in a lot of ways.
A lot. I mean, as everyone. So I mean, like, first of all, the things we're able to our traditional mechanisms of like doing, these performance management meetings is completely disrupted. Obviously, we've jumped into, really using data to look at COVID and our city's COVID response, as one of the primary things we do. We have scaled back some of the other like things we're reviewing data, to look at. So I would say, just from a kind of like the types of things we're working on, it is really, it's changed them. The other thing I would say is our team, has been asked to kind of monitor a whole set of new things that are quite internal to just like our city government's capacity. So for example, we've had to stand up systems to track, how many of our city employees have COVID or not, to what extent where folks are coming into the office still versus working remotely. These are tools that our city leaders need to just even manage the continuing business of city government. And we didn't really have systems for tracking before. So my team has had to stand up all these new like systems for tracking these different things, which we just didn't have before. So that's another way in which COVID has changed the types of things that we are looking at and that we're focused on as an office.
All right. Well, if there's no further questions for Dan, I just want to thank you for jumping in so quickly into this and for joining us today and to giving us this great presentation.
Tim, and thanks everyone for having me, and glad to like answer more questions as they come up. I really appreciate you having me.
And John, is it okay if we share Dan, is it okay if we share your contact information?
Sure. Yeah, please do. Yep.
Okay, that's great. We'll put that in the chat.
Okay.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. All right, well, up next, we have Lawrence Grandpre. You remember maybe in the first week, if you joined us, that we had the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Davon Love gave a wonderful presentation, highest rated presentation so far. But Lawrence he's the Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and he provides the research needed to facilitate effective political awareness campaigns, organize civil demonstrations, city education events, and legislative advocacy efforts for policy reforms that impact Black people in Baltimore, according to their website. And I know that he's also co-authored a book, the Black Book, Reflections from the Baltimore Grassroots with Davon Love. His analysis on a variety of issues that impact citizens of Baltimore has been featured in places like the Baltimore Sun, Time Magazine, The Guardian, BuzzFeed, and Huffington Post. And with that, I'd like to welcome Lawrence. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you fine.
Great. I'm so happy to be here today. And so what I wanted to do is give a presentation that I have given a few different times over the years. And I think it really gets to a fundamental issue that LBS tries to address, which is not only advancing what you could call a progressive policy agenda, but also trying to use an analysis of history and analysis of culture to explain some of the potential blind spots within dominant progressive ideological frames of analysis. So I got interested in the issue of cannabis as someone who is not a cannabis consumer, really because I realized as a person who does political advocacy that you're going to have new revenue coming into the state government. And when you have new revenue coming into the state government, you have the ability to advocate for that revenue to go places that can really help the community and doesn't demand that you cut an existing source of revenue. And honestly, I've been a little bit surprised in terms of this being a very, very prominent issue in the so-called progressive mainstream. You almost never hear about what to do with tax revenue. And I think that speaks to a reticence to deal with fundamental issues of power and actually how we define power, and having a historical understanding of the difference between charity and actually creating the conditions for the community to empower itself. And people with really good intentions sort of using the existing frames that they have and projecting them onto different issues in ways that lead to solutions that are very, very different from what the grassroots are actually calling for and very, very different, I fear, from what actually would address the problem. So I'm going to give this talk through the frame of reparations for the war on drugs. And though I feel this frame has been talked about in some conversations, how I frame it might be a little bit different. So I'm going to click the share screen button, and hopefully this will go through. Okay, so are people seeing the presentation?
Yep, we can see it.
Great, great, great. So if you look at the date, unfortunately, the year is not marked on this slide, but I like to show this slide because that's April 23rd, 2015. So this was the talk I was supposed to give basically during the beginnings of the height of the Baltimore uprising. And during this talk, I want to explicitly link the issue of cannabis to Baltimore's history and the conditions that led to specifically the conditions around the Baltimore uprising. But I think this is an example of a larger point I want to make about policy advocacy, where we get so sucked into, and sometimes it's inevitable, the acute crisis, that understanding long-term policy to invest in building power, and also having a historical context to understand the historical reasons why we are where we are, oftentimes fall by the wayside because the crisis feels so acute and the need feels so great in the moment that we lose the ability to have a deeper historical analysis and a more rich analysis of building institutions that can actually be owned and controlled by community to address these problems. So first, I'm going to go into some of the history, and then I'm going to go into some of the future in terms of defining what I mean by reparations, instead of using that as a frame to talk about this larger issue of policy advocacy. All right, so some of the people on this call might know who that is. That, of course, is Pancho Villa, the famous Mexican revolutionary. And he's really, I think, a necessary starting point to have a conversation around the issue of cannabis in relation to the war on drugs and reparations. As many of you know, many people call it cannabis, even though colloquially, many people refer to it as marijuana. And marijuana is oftentimes described as a pejorative term for cannabis, which is the actual Latin scientific name, that was used to kind of frame cannabis in the 20s, 30s, and 40s as a dangerous weed that is linked to Mexican immigrants intoxicating themselves and committing crimes. So the racial roots of even the language we use to talk about the war on drugs is an important starting point, as is the historical trajectory of drug policy. So some of you may have heard of this guy. This guy is very, very important. There's a great book called Chasing. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. The slides, it's not on present mode and it's not advancing. We're still on slide 1. Sorry.
Okay. So let me see what I can do about that. 1 second. You all see Henry Antwinker?
Yes, yeah, we can see him.
Oh, okay. Great. So let me just make sure. Okay, so Henry Antwinker is the former head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and there's a great book called Chasing the Scream, which discusses his role in not only establishing the current frame of federal drug policy that we use today, but he in particular was a manifestation of a specifically racialized theory of drug policy. So, for example, he was one of the people who targeted Billie Holiday, Baltimore native, and made her a demonstration of his theory that drugs were encouraging vice by encouraging Negro artists to do things like use heroin, and then seducing the white masses with their jazz music and its links to vice. But he really established a federal authority to crack down on drug use, because previously, as some of you may know, things like opium were very commonly used in like women's tonics and things like that. And it really is in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that the issue of drugs becomes racialized and federalized through the lens of Henry Antwinker. And to take a brief detour, because I do think it's interesting of the relationship to urban policing. The person on the right is an interesting figure. That's, of course, William Randolph Hearst. So William Randolph Hearst had some land holdings in Mexico that were confiscated by Villa and revolutionaries. And if you believe some theories, William Randolph Hearst was worried that his holdings in timber would be challenged by the use of hemp, which of course is essentially the same plant as cannabis, but without high levels of the intoxicant THC to print paper on. He, of course, owned a bunch of newspapers and knew a good story when he saw it. So for all those reasons, Hearst uses his publishing empire to really promote the racialized frame of fear of Black and brown intoxication through cannabis use, opium use, as a nationwide moral panic around the issue of drugs. So that produces the conditions for what happens in the 60s and 70s. So some of you may know the woman on screen. You all see the woman on screen, correct?
Yep.
Great. So that some of you may know is Patty Hearst. Patty Hearst, I believe, is the niece of William Randolph Hearst. She, of course, many of you will know, is famous for being kidnapped and quote unquote brainwashed by the Symbionese Liberation Army. And I use Patty Hearst not just because of the relationship with William Randolph Hearst, but because one of the mistakes I think some of our, many people, some of them liberals, some of them leftists, some of them Marxists, is to overemphasize the political economy issues around drugs and incarceration and underemphasize the social, emotional frames that animate policy. So Patty Hearst wasn't just a rich white woman who was brainwashed by, and let me be very clear on this, the Symbionese Liberation Army was in really no way an extension of the Black radical tradition. This is a few charismatic leaders with an ideology that is no way representative of the action of so-called, like someone like the Black Panthers, who actually had an organized base of people who supported them. But people didn't make those fine distinctions in the 60s and 70s. And the racialized fear of civil rights, Black power, the rise of militant demands for community self-determination were conflated with something that was seen as inherently violent, inherently a threat to white order, and specifically a threat to racialized white women. So much of drug policy, even today, reflects this sort of specifically racialized and gendered fear of needing to protect white civilization from an imagined dark threat that goes back not only to the 30s, but all the way back in America's history to fears of Native American attacks on American villages, fear of slave revolts in the American South, and a generalized anxiety around this notion of civilization, being in control of your faculties, rationality, and intoxication being the exact opposite of that. And so all of these fears combine to make drugs a potent tool for the expansion of police power and the militarization of police. So what we're seeing here is the Los Angeles Police Department's raid on, I think it's actually the Black Panther office in the late 60s. So in the late 60s, there was, of course, mid 60s, the Watts riot. So this was before 68, before the MLK riots in many other cities. LA had the Watts riot just a few days after, I believe, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And there was this anxiety amongst urban police departments around the country that they were essentially being outgunned by urban guerrillas who were threatened by them. The reality of that analysis is not as important as what it represents in the psychology of many of the people in big cities at the time and what it did to police departments. So the man on the right is an extremely important figure in American history. That's Daryl Gates. Gates was the leader of the LAPD and is not the inventor of the SWAT team. He is the person who popularized the SWAT team. He is the person who advocated for the SWAT team to become a concept that was brought from big cities like LA to small towns around the country. If you read Ridley Balco's book, The Rise of the Warrior Cop, one of the things he talks about is towns with like 10, 5,000 people in the middle of nowhere feel the need to have SWAT teams, because policing becomes an expression of this racialized anxiety, this fear of drug dealers, heavily armed drug dealers, or heavily armed Black militants who are a threat to the social order. And we need a powerful, violent police force to be able to deter them and keep them in check. So what you're seeing is a battering ram attached to a tank that Daryl Gates argued the LAPD should buy. And so talking about these larger issues of defund police, talking about these larger issues of police militarization, you have to look at the role of the drug war, and specifically this racialized frame of drug policy in creating the conditions that we're facing now. So many of you will have heard this quote before. I'll read it. I'll try to read it quickly. This is John Ehrlichman, assistant to President Nixon, talking about what the drug war's utility was in that federal policy framework. And we'll complicate that a little bit later in terms of the over-focus, I believe, on federal policy, but it trickles down and is representative of what's happening at state levels around the country. So you want to know what this was really all about. Nixon had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and in criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So if you read a history of Nixon's so-called Southern strategy, it's interesting to learn it was in many ways baked in the North. It was baked specifically in New Hampshire, which is an early primary state in both the Democrat and Republican parties. And he realized, even though there weren't really Black people in New Hampshire, when he went to New Hampshire, this rhetoric around law and order did exceedingly well. He was able to get a stunning response from, in many ways, suburbs of Boston, living in New Hampshire, not really interacting with urban environments, so they could project this illusion of racialized chaos onto these big cities, and then desire someone like Nixon to use drug policy as a tool to specifically constrain and criminalize Black civil society, not just Black militancy, but Black life itself. Because as we all know, I hope we all know at this point, historically and today, Black communities and white communities use drugs at the same rate. And for the most part, you buy drugs from people who look like you. So though they use and sell drugs at the same rates, there's a specifically racialized fear of the drug communities in urban Black America. But the federal government does not have a police force in the United States of America. In the 70s, it was not easy to build up a political framework to allow the federal government to actually control policing. What the federal government did control, because of Henry Antwinker, was drug policy. So Nixon realized that he can use an analysis of the drug war, interstate commerce, international commerce, and being able to incentivize federal deployments into actual states with federal artillery, federal helicopters, federal muscle. That could be the way he uses the federal government to produce policing policy that benefits him politically. And this is the beginning of the incarceration spike that we see. So soon after Nixon declares the war on drugs, we began to see the spike. And I use this particular image specifically because, as you see, we're talking about the federal system. The federal system is a very small part of the actual incarceration picture. The vast, vast majority of this is happening at a state level. So while it's important to focus on things like mandatory minimums, it's important to focus on things like legalization at a federal level. But we are so seduced by the federal frame for policy, the presidential election, senatorial elections, the Supreme Court nominations, it oftentimes obscures the fact that policing is a state and local government issue fundamentally. Federal government gives no more than usually 5 to 10% of the budgets in most big city departments of policing departments. So you have to look at a state and local issue and take local accountability for these policy changes at the state and local level to address these dynamics where they actually express themselves at a state and local level. So that gets us to Baltimore. And that gets us to why I specifically want to frame a theory of reparations around what happened in Baltimore. So I had a video from Todd Clear. It's actually fine just to keep the tech clean. I won't show the video, but Todd Clear is a professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And he is one of the few folks who are statistically doing the analysis that proves intuitively what many of us have understood for years in the Black community, which is not only does incarceration not deter crime, I don't know if you knew this, but most criminals do not believe they're going to be caught. They make decisions on criminality independent of the actual police presence because it's an issue of economics that demands for them to engage in the street economy. However, when you have hyper incarceration in America is hyper targeted, not just on Black people in general, but on specific zip codes where Black people are predominant. So in Baltimore, that would look like a place like Penn North, Pennsylvania Avenue, Upton, Sandtown, these communities that are specifically targeted by hyper incarceration and hyper police presence. Todd Clear actually includes Baltimore in his book, Imprisoning Communities, which is pretty good. Up to 20% of these communities, the whole community at any given time, at the height of incarceration in the late 80s, early to mid 90s, will be in jail. Not parole and probation, not home arrest, in jail. So what people often fail to understand, making the public safety argument, is that they argue you have to take selected individuals from the community to secure the rest of the community. What ends up happening in reality in America is that you put so many people in jail from these communities, the community itself is just in jail. So that destabilizes the community, not only when these folks need to be reintegrated into community and they have traumatic experiences in jail, they have lost the ability to receive federal subsidies, federal housing, food stamps in many cases, in addition to their right to vote in many states. Maryland recently corrected this. But the social fabric that these individuals, largely young men, were benefiting from, but also creating for themselves, has been torn apart. So the mentoring relationships, the fact that these young men and women are helping people pay rent, helping people buy diapers, helping people get to school, helping people get to medical care for their grandparents, get to church. Hyper-incarceration causes ripple effects of community disruption that actually produces more criminality than it ever can deter. So again, I use Todd Clear. I don't actually love his theory because he uses the term informal social control, which is basically the social fabric of a community creating alternatives to engaging in criminal activity. And I think that term is kind of steeped in the academic analysis that obscures the ethical reality of what's happening when we use that term, but also just the cultural reality of the church groups, the basketball leagues, the technological I had an elder Black man teach me technology when I was growing up. And those are the type of relationships, installing hard drives, learning how to do like rudimentary coding. Those are the type of relationships that get disrupted when people like that 40-year-old Black man are in jail for doing what someone in Baltimore County can do all the time, carry a bag of weed. That produces so much social disruption that you see the initial dip in criminality as hyper-incarceration begins, but then a massive spike in these specific zip codes where up to 20% of the whole population in that footprint is in jail, which creates a vicious cycle. Because what happens when you disrupt the social fabric and people have no alternative but to engage in the street economy? In America, traditionally, and in Baltimore specifically, we have sent more police in, which has only exacerbated the dynamic further. And that, of course, leads us to specifically Sandtown, Winchester, the community that produced the Baltimore Uprising. So I have an entire piece on this written on our website. So LBS has a subsequent website where we store much of our academic material, the New Timbuktu website. And in the website, I go in depth on Sandtown, Winchester, the community produced the Baltimore uprising, because unbeknownst to many, especially if you're from out of town, but even if you're from Baltimore and born around the early 90s, Sandtown, Winchester was targeted by the Clinton administration to be a poster child of urban renewal. And tens and even hundreds of millions of dollars was pumped into Sandtown, Winchester in the early to mid 90s to make that community the poster child for inner city investment under the Clinton administration. And I argue that the Baltimore uprising happened not despite that investment, but specifically because of that investment. Because that investment, by not centering the existing culture and institutions in that community, it served the exact same role as hyper-incarceration, to disrupt the existing social fabric, social network, to eliminate the ability to produce what Todd Clear calls informal social control, what I just call community cohesion. So I'm just going to read one quote from the piece that I wrote on the website, and I don't think it's going to show on your screen, but it's actually a quote from the book Black Baltimore, A New Theory of Community by Harold McDougall, who was in Sandtown, Winchester in the late 80s, early 90s as this project. It was originally called the Nehemiah Project. It ended up being called Neighborhood Transformation Initiative, NTI, because originally the Black churches such as Build were central in the project. They kind of left, and the people ended up taking it over with the Kurt Schmoke administration, and the nonprofit wing of the Rouse Company and their sort of urban development wing. And here is, I think, the quote that Harold McDougall, professor of law at Howard University, uses to sum up the failure and the danger of Nehemiah and all subsequent, including to today, attempts to invest in community that do not reflect the culture of the community. Quote, community resident Athena Young carried on a street survey of Sandtown with my assistance in the summer of 1991. The diversity we observed was in our first assessment was amazing. We passed evidence of Muslim and Black nationalist activity, a Muslim carryout on Carey Street, the Nation Builders #2 bookstore on North Avenue, now known as Everyone's Place, one of the few places that did not burn down during the Baltimore uprising. That's me editorializing there. And the Nation Builders #2 bookstore, a Black street vendor who lives in the area and comes out around lunchtime and stays until dark. Arabers, Black vendors who sell fruit, vegetables, and fish from horse-drawn wagons in West Baltimore gather on Winchester Street at the stable of Sandtown senior Araber, whose street name is Fatback. There they collected their produce and merchandise to sell on the streets of Sandtown. Fatback stable was later bulldozed to make way for the Nehemiah Project. So in that quote, I want to direct your attention to the map. I know it's hard to read, but this map is indicative not only of what I believe is the failure of Nehemiah, but the failure of many of our approaches to what we call reparations to the war on drugs today. So you see a lot on this map. You see buildings, you see housing, you see redeveloping the Upton market, which is largely putting a new facade on the market and bringing in a dollar store, which is seen as economic development because the dollar store brings jobs. Now, many of you are familiar with critiques of Walmart and the economic roles they play in terms of undercutting the price point of many small local businesses. Well, dollar stores do that on a smaller scale. So what they envision as bringing jobs and bringing vitality and culture to Sandtown, Winchester, they didn't value the existing network of institutions that Athena Young and Harold McDougall just told you existed. So they, in an attempt to save the community, undercut the existing fabric of the community because Fatback Stable can't compete with 4 for $1 Chef Boyardee soups from dollar store because they can use their massive corporate buying power to buy in bulk and undercut the price of any local small vendors. But that's not what I showed this map for. If you can see, there are tiny little X's essentially on this map, like stop signs. in every single one of these stop signs is what they call drug nuisance abatement, a very flowery term for let's send in the police to deal with the drug problem. And so in the name of, again, reviving the community, the theory was send in the police to, again, extract the negative element of the community to protect the good element. But what happened, of course, was, like I said, hyper-incarceration, not, again, despite this supposedly racially justice-framed investment, but specifically because Rouse, Schmoke, and the people doing Nehemiah wanted to protect their investment. That is not to say that people did not benefit from neighborhood transformation initiative. Many people did. I would argue, and this is not me arguing, this is conversations I have had with people who actually implemented the program in the 90s. It was largely despite that program being run by Rouse and the sort of well-meaning nonprofit people who they brought in. There was lots of job training that was done, but the people who benefited from the job training were the people who were already pretty good. They were living in Sandtown, but they were really motivated. They probably already had a job, already had some skills. They built their own culture and community in those job training courses, and they helped each other out, encouraged each other. They benefited from NTI, and guess what they did? They moved out of Sandtown. Maybe didn't move to the county, maybe didn't move to PG County, but they moved out of the core Sandtown, Winchester footprint near Gilmore Homes, which created a leadership vacuum, a civil society vacuum, a informal social control vacuum, if you will, of the people who were most stable in that community. And this is, again, the exact communities that produced the Baltimore uprising. Again, many of the people who know the timeline actually understand that it was calls to increase drug nuisance abatement at the actual corner of, I think, Pennsylvania and Cary that actually led to increased police presence in the weeks before Frederick Gay got put in that van. So this model of the illusion of policing as a tool to secure community has persisted from the 30s through the 60s, through the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s, all the way up to 2015. But certainly, and just to sort of give you the visual example, here is the arrest map of marijuana arrest prior to marijuana decriminalization. And as you can see, the geographic footprint is largely in West Baltimore, Northwest Baltimore. So this is downtown. You go east of downtown, it's spattered throughout Northwest. This is pretty much exactly mapping onto the so-called Black Butterfly. So this is the map of the population of Black residents in Baltimore. And again, it's almost a perfect map onto the actual cannabis arrests. Despite what we just said, Blacks and whites using and selling cannabis at almost exactly the same rates. And of course, despite millions of dollars invested in NTI, Sandtown, Winchester remained one of the primary neighborhoods that these arrests were taking place in, producing the conditions that led to the Baltimore uprising. So I give that to kind of frame the specifics of what I mean when I say cannabis, more on drug separations. It is that community cohesion, the civil society networks that were disrupted by hyper-incarceration that Todd Clear talks about. But again, this is the analysis that Black people have been making of the prison industrial complex from Druba Ben Wahid to George Jackson to Angela Davis, long before Todd Clear ever got a PhD. And it's important because reestablishing that social fabric cannot be limited to charity and cannot be limited to entrepreneurial activity in the cannabis economy. Those can be part of a strategy, but the specifics of how you implement that strategy are the difference between actual reparations and a new neighborhood transformation initiative that replicates the exact flaws of the previous NTI. So with my last, I'm gonna try to keep it to maybe 15 minutes, then we'll get to Q&A. I'm gonna flesh out some of that theory around cannabis reparations. This is the map of cannabis. It is a very fast moving issue. You cannot get bogged down in the technocratic elements. These are the dark blue states have all legalized recreational cannabis. Light green states, have some form of medicinal cannabis or medicinal cannabis oil. So Louisiana does not have medicinal cannabis you can smoke. They do allow cannabis oil. If your kid has seizures and needs CBD, you can do that. The important thing to note is that medicinal cannabis typically does not have an additional tax on it to generate revenue for the state. People have argued, and I think it makes sense, that this is medicine. You should not tax people's medicine. So it's when I say reparations, I'm really talking about the tax revenue produced by recreational cannabis, which is Michigan, Illinois, Colorado, all the dark green states. They all have different models. None of them reflect what I would call a best practice that is truly reparations. And I'm going to try to flesh out some of these dynamics. So as I said before, cannabis reparations cannot be limited to entrepreneurship. However, and this is something I had to evolve on too, you cannot ignore the reality that many people have been doing cannabis entrepreneurship for decades, and now they're seeing white people getting rich on what they did and got sent to jail for. Additionally, as much as people like social programs, many people don't want to go through the red tape. They have entrepreneurial spirit, and they just want to be free to do what they want, make their own money, and take care of their families through that lens. And that's important because as liberals or progressives, many people assume that it's only through being guided through a government process or through a level of technocratic engagement that you can actually achieve positive results, and trusting lower level entrepreneurs to actually be able to access the legal market and make their own way through their own entrepreneurial activity is really essential for people who don't have the skill set or the desire to run a nonprofit or go through a grant application or go through a bunch of political fights to get to be allowed to work with youth. And I originally did not want to engage the side of entrepreneurship really at all, because it was so overrun with this monopoly capitalist vulture mentality. But even I had to change my position in relationship to the real grassroots demand of people on the ground, working class Black people, to at least have a chance to fail. There's no guarantee of success in entrepreneurship, but look at the amount of money that is in this potential space between the medical use and adult use, which is what they used to call recreational. We're looking at up to $20 billion by next year. The pandemic has not hurt these projections, it's actually helped these projections as people are buying even more cannabis. And look at the racial disparity in ownership of cannabis entrepreneurship entities. 81% white, 4% Black, despite not only Black folks being 13 to 15% of the American population, but in some cases, 3 to 8 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession all around the country. It varies from like 2.5 to up to 10 times more likely to be arrested. So when you look at that racial disparity of arrest versus that lack of representation on the business side, even well-meaning folks who are critical of capitalism, like myself, have to recognize that entrepreneurship needs to be a component of reparation strategy. This, of course, is a quote from Michelle Alexander, the person who wrote The New Jim Crow, another person who helped me begin this journey. Here are white men poised to run big cannabis businesses, dreaming of cashing in big money. Big businesses selling weed after 40 years of locking up impoverished Black kids for selling weed. Their families and futures destroyed. Now, white men are planning on getting rich doing precisely the same thing. So being a policy person, it's important to understand that reparations is oftentimes in the details. Every state has done some form of outreach to minority entrepreneurs. Every state has received tons of criticism for the failures of actually bringing in minority entrepreneurs. So some degree of failure is likely inevitable when you're trying to do something very difficult, like bringing in people who don't have a ton of assets, should we say legal assets, that are banked and taxed in their ability to create legal enterprise. But that doesn't mean you don't do it. I mean, you take an analysis of the limitations and you build a strategy to address them. So barriers to entry to the marijuana industry, specifically for Black folks, criminal convictions. Many states are allowing expungement, but oftentimes not of higher level felonies for possession with intent to distribute. So you see folks have minor possession arrests getting in the industry sometimes, but the actual people who were street entrepreneurs are oftentimes still barred because they were charged with intent to distribute, which is like an actual felony. The banking industry is very reticent to engage any cannabis because they're afraid of the federal restrictions on cannabis entrepreneurship, giving their banks extra legal scrutiny. This is only magnified when you deal with minority entrepreneurs. The capital cost. We'll come back to this later, but it's an incredibly difficult to actually bring anyone to the industry who does not have millions of dollars in capital at hand, only magnified with people who've like actually been in jail. Connections to growers. Every industry has an informal social network of people who are basically clicking up, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. So the growers of the big money operation, they control who they sell their weed to. And if you are a distributor, if you want to do a micro enterprise, like create edibles off of someone else's weed and like bake them into cookies, you need a relationship with a grower. And oftentimes, if you're not in the club, which is often a very white club, you're excluded from that opportunity. So nowhere does it say, we don't want working class Black people, middle class Black people being our competition. We're going to freeze them out. No one ever has to say that. It can oftentimes happen informally through the nature of the market. Security, just if you do cannabis in a working class Black community, there are lots of security concerns. There's security concerns for any cannabis industry because these are largely still cash economies. Because of banking, it's very hard to run your credit card to buy recreational cannabis. So having a robust security system is oftentimes cost prohibitive and deters people from opening up shop in Black neighborhoods, working class Black neighborhoods that were most hit by the war on drugs and most need that sort of economic opportunity. And finally, market saturation between people still engaging the Black market and many cannabis companies coming online at the same time. It's not an easy place to make profit. There's a lot of money being made, but it's an expensive space to play. And if we're serious about reparations, we have to take those sort of policy concerns seriously to deal with the illusion of reparations on the business side, which is a few Black and brown faces incorporated on the business side, but the reality is the majority of working class Black people are still excluded from the industry. But I want to get to the illusion of reparations on the investment side, the investment of tax revenue. Because if Davon talked at all about the nonprofit industrial complex, about whiteness infiltrating our minds and our visions of political possibility, this is where it shows up most clearly for me. And this is what I think has been most frustrating. Because nearly every state will claim that they're doing some version of reparations for the war on drugs with their tax revenue from recreational cannabis. But in my estimation, no one's even come close. And I want to sort of parse out the illusion versus the reality a little bit. And we know we don't have a ton of time, but this is the vision of the cannabis entrepreneur: young, smart, data-centric, clean cut. In reality, it's a lot of monopoly. There's a lot of attempts to use monopoly power to completely control the money that flows through. So you sell the weed, the weed store looks like an Apple store, all clean cut and nice, and that produces actual money that then goes back to the monopoly entity and then to the state house. It's the state house in Maryland. And what does the state house spend the money on? What has every state house in the country spent the money on from recreational cannabis? It's a little bit different. But here are 4 key areas that people have claimed are cannabis reparations that need to be critiqued. So education. Who could be against education? We envision people who do work with youth being able to access these new pots of money that are only earmarked for education in general. But if you don't specifically earmark money for individuals who have been impacted by cannabis incarceration, if you don't earmark the money to have a participatory process that determines who gets the money, if you don't allow the community and the parents of these students to have a say on who gets funded, you really risk replicating the white savior industry with this education investment. This is what has happened in states like Illinois, where the barrier to access these grants for working in the community was so high, you already had to be a multi-million-dollar nonprofit with multiple years of edited, audited tax statements to even apply for the money. And that's just going to replicate the big players in the spaces who do not reflect the pedagogy and the support and will of people in the community to a substantial degree. There are always exceptions. There's always complexity, but this is a big reason why just giving money to education cannot be seen as reparation. Because reparation empowers the community aggrieved, not in a general of giving services to them, but empowering themselves to choose who does the services and what the services are. And that's a big difference. Job training. Who doesn't love job training? This is what we envision. Young Black men with suits on, cleaned up, off the corner, getting access to economic opportunity. In reality, a lot of job training, and this is with all due respect to the people in the workforce sector, is oftentimes the state paying an employer to do their job training, which they should be paying for themselves. It is limited to one employer building up a workforce for a project they were already going to do. And so the skills you get in the job training oftentimes are not transferable to other jobs, and they are definitely not transferable to entrepreneurial activity, which, given the demographic we're talking about, young Black men, 15 to 35, 45, they probably have other convictions besides cannabis that are not expungible and will make it hard for them to access traditional employment. So when you take away the entrepreneurial option, which many states have done, and only earmark money for job training, which, as I said, is oftentimes investing in an already existing project, you just replicate the dynamic where Black communities are dependent on some larger white corporate or larger white philanthropic nonprofit entity to do development for them, and we're begging them to get access to their developments, not giving the community the autonomy to do the development itself, which is a prerequisite for anything worth being called reparations. Third, drug treatment. This is Bubbles from The Wire. The drug addict was a heart of gold, cleaning Bubbles up, getting him out of the basement, getting him clean. This is what we envision when we think of drug treatment. But increasingly, the face of drug addiction has shifted to the white suburban opioid epidemic. And independent of where you do the investment in drug treatment, the pedagogy and methodology of drug treatment reflects the dominant status quo, which is 12-step. And if anyone knows anything at all about 12-step, it does help some people, but the failure rate of 12-step is like 85%. And 12-step is literally a pedagogy of an evangelical Christian ideology from the 1930s in Ohio. I've been researching this for 3 years. I was stunned to understand the level of self-hatred 12-step inculcates in you, where you're like a failure and you have to completely embrace powerlessness. That may not be an effective ideology for people who suffer from systemic oppression, to embrace powerlessness. So what we need is to embrace investing in the community itself to produce drug treatment methodologies that reflect their culture and their ideologies, which is the exact opposite of investing in the existing drug treatment networks. Another example of something being sold to us as reparations is really the exact opposite. This is the easiest one. Nearly every state has done this. And in the moment we're in now, I hope it's going to be harder, but I doubt that the police will not try to get a piece of this tax revenue. In every single state, the police have argued legalization of cannabis is going to increase demands on our police department. We already have drunk driving with recreational cannabis. Now we're going to have high driving. There's no test for cannabis intoxication. So you have to give us, the police department, more money to do the thing we should, in theory, have already been doing for the past 50 years, addressing people driving under cannabis intoxication. And of course, while they claim this is only going to address high driving, this is a recipe for disproportionate minority contact and more driving while Black cases. If you look even at Maryland, Prince George's County decriminalized cannabis in this decade. Academic studies have showed that rather than decreasing disproportionate minority contact, arrests actually ticked up with decriminalization. This is called the net widening effect, where because the cops knew they weren't going to send people to jail for minor cannabis infractions, they wrote more cannabis infractions for stuff they normally just would have let slide and ignored, you know. And this is the unfortunate reality of when we don't use actual data and an empirical liberatory lens that focuses community self-determination as the frames through which we view the data. So it's not enough to have data, and it's not enough to use rhetoric of community self-determination. You need to have both, and you need to apply them to effectively, objectively analyze what any of these forms of investment will do for a community. And unfortunately for me, these four dominant, though not exclusive, frames of cannabis revenue investment not only fail to meet the criteria of reparations, in most cases they do the exact opposite. They lock in dependency of minority communities, of institutions and infrastructure they do not control, to the detriment of building up independent infrastructure in community, which, as we know through Todd Clear, that community cohesion is how you actually build the community muscles, the community strengths to produce alternatives to the street economy in the first place. So I don't know if that sounds harsh. We'll find out in the Q&A, but that's my analysis of the existing reparations, quote unquote, reparations for the war on drugs analysis. And here's some of the alternative. Okay, so yeah, we're running out of time. I'll try to be brief. Reparations are real, not rhetorical or ideological. So again, actual analysis and policy that's evaluated, and not just what people say the community wants, not what people say the community needs. You're going to hear a lot of that. And it's very hard and frustrating to determine what's real and what's fake. You got to have some sort of lens and community guidance to help evaluate that. Interest convergence, not moral suasion, is key. I'm going to pursue this strategy of investing in local communities and giving them the power to decide what they want to spend money on, because I think that's going to work the best. I'm going to sell you that you don't have to care about Black people. This is where LBS fundamentally diverges from many of the current orthodoxy on racial anti-racism. I am not going to allow the survival of my community to be dependent on the moral suasion of people who empirically have not been morally swayed enough to give up power by our suffering and our calls for humanity. But you have a problem that if you don't vote for this, I can vote you out. And you have a problem that your existing investment in policing is making you look really bad and not working to deter crime. So if I convince you that if you give me and my community the money, we can address the problems that are currently occurring in our communities ourselves, like addiction and crime, then you don't have to worry about that being an issue for you. And if you don't, I'll just get you voted out. So this is the reality of interest convergence, where typically it works against Black communities. If you know the legal theorist Derek Bell, Black law professor at Harvard, talked about the failure of Brown v. Board and it being an example of not genuinely caring about Black people being integrated into schools. We know it couldn't have been, because Black people are not integrated into schools today. It occurred in the 1950s, directly after the Korean War. And Bell wants to ask himself why, after Korean War, Korea was the first integrated war, where you have a lot of Black veterans coming home who have fought for America, don't want to deal with America's BS anymore, and are willing to fight violently to deal with it. But also, Korea is totally under-discussed at the beginning of the true Cold War. We are at war with communism, and we can't be at war with communism with these nations around the world decolonizing, Black and brown nations decolonizing, and trying to pick, the capitalist sphere of influence or the communist sphere of influence, when you're sticking dogs on people for wanting to eat at a lunch counter. So Bell, a civil rights lawyer who worked with Thurgood Marshall on school desegregation cases, basically looks at his career and says, I was wrong. Thurgood Marshall was wrong. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund was wrong, that we over-focused on the legal aspects of equality, not understanding they allowed us to have equality in a legal facade because that was useful for that Cold War propaganda, and it was useful for them to capture movements in the courts rather than having movements fight at a grassroots level on the streets. So that's how interest convergence has worked against us. Interest convergence is a fact of life for Black people. this is the reality Derek Bell is asking us to grapple with that gets him called a racial pessimist and dismissed by not only conservatives, but also many racial liberals, including people in the Obama camp, who when the conservatives came for him under Obama, basically washed their hands of him and ignored him, his legacy. He died in 2008, I believe. Derek Bell is one of the most important legal figures of all time. He is a figure that's essential to our theory of politics and says if we want to actually get policy to pass, you can get reparations to pass. It is not abstract. It is not inherently utopian just because we use the word reparations, but only if we use actual material leverage through interest convergence to leverage a reparation policy, which is why I'm not talking to you about HR 40, about reparations. That's a study bill. That's a long-term strategy down the road. What I want to do is build a proof of concept with reparations for the war on drugs so that as something like HR 40 reveals the deep inequities baked into the entire American foundation, people say, what do we do? And we say, hey, look at Baltimore. We have living examples of methodologies that use empowering grassroots communities, Black communities, to make their own decisions on who they give money to rebuild their social fabric, and that's what reparations is. So this is an intentional effort to link to those larger reparations calls by building an empirical basis that they can draw upon as they build more expansive claims. So this is that reformism versus total revolutionary theory. Like, do we go for reparations for slavery itself? I don't think there's a duality between the two. Yes, and finally, collective repression requires collective response. So again, America is a very individualistic country. We are seduced by the rhetoric of individual freedom, individual choice, individual policy, individual entrepreneurship, individual tax breaks. When you're dealing with a collective oppression, what you have to do is empower the collective to be able to invest in itself and control its own resources. So that again, is far beyond individual Black people getting to grow weed, individual Black people getting to sell weed. As you may know, the Black politician in Maryland who was most allied with brokering deals for individual Black people to get access to the cannabis industry was indicted for bribery. And we clashed for her on a lot of other issues independent of cannabis. But that's why we weren't a part of that initial push for cannabis diversity with medical cannabis, because we understood that was individual Black people getting, individual rich Black people getting richer and calling that liberation for Black masses and calling that reparations. And we need to be able to go beyond that frame, so it is seductive for a lot of well-meaning people to see a larger vision. So reparations for individuals can only be done by empowering the community. So I'm just gonna have to skip a few slides to get to, I'm just gonna get to the last slide on investment. If you have questions on the business stuff, we can talk about that in Q&A, but I'm just gonna make this my last slide to give you some time for Q&A. Because this is demonstrative of the methodology of reparations that I think is at the core of why I wanted to give this talk. So right now we have people in jail. We have to not only expunge previous sentences, we have to re-sentence people currently still in jail for cannabis-related crimes and give them the opportunity to free themselves. We have to change the face of entrepreneurship away from the Steve Jobs looking guy who has a cannabis shop that looks like an Apple store, to the actual diversity of the Black community and entrepreneurial models that reflect the reality of diversifying the entire industry, not just the top. So when the tax revenue comes down and it goes to the State House, we have to produce or isolate and have the community select a grant-making institution, put the money there, but that grant-making institution should not be empowered to pick for themselves who gets that money. The people who should be empowered, and I don't know if you see the little circles on the map, are communities and institutions that reflect the people actually impacted by cannabis war on drugs enforcement. And we need to give those communities the key to unlock that revenue. So this is participatory grant making. But this is not what the status quo typically calls participatory grant making, which is oftentimes, here's your little sandbox, here's a couple of $10, $20, $30, $40, $50,000. We're gonna have you make this pretty speech and we're going to vote on who we think should get the money. You need to invest the capital in terms of millions of dollars into long-term investments in the Black and brown communities selected by those communities themselves. Yeah, and you need to, so yeah, I think that's actually a good place to stop. I know that's a lot, but I wanted to try to at least create some time for Q&A. We're almost an hour right now. And again, this is an issue that's very important to me because like I said, it's an issue that I think is oftentimes really, really contorted through not really quite a white savior lens, because it isn't about white people per se. It's about a normalization of the tools we use in the status quo and assumption that they are both necessary and sufficient to address the reality of what is hurting Black communities. And if we look historically, if we look empirically, if we actually just use common sense, I think we can understand that if you don't have robust, mandated, institutional accountability to the communities that are impacted and giving them the self-determination to choose for themselves how they view their restoration of their social fabric, those things are maybe not necessarily bad, but they can't be reparations. And I want to use that term to build a wedge between what I think has become the philanthropic, charity-based impulse to use the existing institutions, whether through, I believe, misplaced theory of pragmatism, or just an assumption that that's all we can do. Building a new institution is too hard. Who do you get? Who is actually has the technical skills to do it? And these are the questions that we've had to answer with building the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. LBS has worked with the people doing that very extensively, because those were all the things people said when the Youth Fund came to town. We just got to use the existing institution. We just got to use Strong City Baltimore, which is what almost everyone said when we first initially had the Youth Fund. And now, of course, Strong City is really struggling, and the Youth Fund has been able to demonstrate, I think, a portfolio and practice of using genuine participatory decision-making to invest in the diversity of organizations that I didn't even know existed. Some of them I may not even agree with, but that was a decision made by that body, and no one was able to put their fingers on the scale. No one was able to control it. It was just what the community deemed should be invested in. And we did the Youth Fund, I think, as a model for what we hope could be done with something like cannabis tax revenue. So when we talk about advocacy strategies, they don't exist in isolation. They exist in a constellation, in a network with each other to build upon existing models and advance the work further. And I think that's part of the strategic advocacy vision that LBS has been trying to create in our work here in Maryland and Baltimore, and try to spread that ideology and understanding of why we do what we do around the country and to people who are interested in learning and growing. And so with that, I thank you and look forward to some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence, for that thoughtful presentation. Today was all about new thinking, rethinking, design thinking, and your session was really great food for thought on two of the key issues that people are working on in the groups today, economic equality and criminal justice reform. So thank you for that. I have one question. If you've got questions for Lawrence, please put them in the Q&A. The first question is, are there, this probably depends on the states, are there data sets available to see where particular states spend their cannabis funds?
Yeah, like I said, it's evolving very quickly. And every state has a different way of dispersing the revenue. Colorado put a lot of it back into their general fund and actually mandated some of it get returned to their citizens if they collect too much. So Colorado, with that sort of anti-tax framework, it's like, if we collect too much, we'll give you some back. California gave some to research institutions. They gave some to the police. And California is a mess. They had this weird system of like opt-in versus opt-out, determining like some places don't have any recreational cannabis shops at all, so they don't get any tax revenue from this pot. It's just a huge patchwork. But what I think, and we have no data to evaluate empirically the nature of any of these investments in terms of what they will have done for community, because it's all too new. Illinois is the best example of what I think is most representative of what I think is the spirit of what I'm trying to talk about, but also most representative of what I think has failed as we've applied status quo methodologies to this concept. So they have what's called the R3 fund. It's like restore, renew, reinvest. And they have like, I think 20% of the revenue going to a panel that will then decide what to invest in terms of investing in communities impacted by the war on drugs. So in theory, I think it's a really good concept. The problem is twofold. First, the panel is selected of the representatives at the state level, the state house, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And there are 4 token slots for returning citizens. And that concentrates too much power in that panel. And 4 returning citizens do not actually have the ability, I think, to be truly representative of the diversity of the community, and community can't really hold those folks accountable. So finally, Illinois criteria, that's the place I was talking about, where they have very explicit criteria on who can apply for that money. And the burdens are so high that only sort of existing multi-million-dollar nonprofits can request money from that pot of money. And it completely excludes entrepreneurial activity. It focuses on things like gun violence prevention, and sort of this public health approach, which has really been dominated by like people connected with the public health infrastructure, people connected to Johns Hopkins, people connected to the University of Chicago. And that's just not going to be the average person who went to jail for selling cannabis, or anyone from community deeply impacted by those issues. So Illinois, I think, is the example of how the best laid plans can really just replicate the nonprofit industrial complex. And I've actually had to go to lawmakers in Maryland and explain to them, I don't want the Illinois model. I want you to give the money to localities themselves. Take the power out of the state capital and put it in the hands of the folks at a local level, because I can pressure folks at a local level. Again, it's kind of counterintuitive, because we think if we just keep it all in the hands of the people who are the best, the experts, it'll be safe. But you have to trust community to have meaningful input on the process. And that means you have to kick it to the localities that are most impacted by the war on drugs. So that's what we're advocating for in Maryland.
And I just got a private message from Samuel saying, thanks, that was very helpful. I have John here that has a question for you, and he'll ask it directly.
Hi, Lawrence. Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This has been great. Just a quick question. I wanted to follow up. You mentioned about this kind of brain drain issue that you saw after some of the Sandtown workforce development programs. And I'm sure you saw that ABLE report talking about how most of population loss across Baltimore City is actually middle-class working Black folks. So how do you counter that? I mean, what do you think about this continued population loss problem, and then kind of the better off people? You know, to me, it feels like, you know, they just don't want their kids getting shot by the cops. So if they do better, they're going to leave the city. I mean, what do you think about that? How can we keep folks here?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
So some people, and I've actually seen YouTube documentaries that make this argument, that basically argue that, like, this is proof that it's not a race thing, because Black people are choosing for themselves to leave Baltimore behind. It's important to understand, I think the opposite is true, is that because people understand racism is real, they know that Baltimore as a Black city is going to be treated really poorly in terms of the ability to get the infrastructure to invest in its communities. So I'm going to move to Baltimore County or PG County as a recognition of the reality of racism, right? So these folks that move out, they're fully cognizant of the reality of racism.
For sure.
And they are just trying to do what they can to survive it. So this is just survival strategy. And as someone whose family's moved from Baltimore City to Baltimore County, my personal experience, and I believe the intellectual frame I'm using, really demonstrates an analysis of what's lost in that move that isn't always tangible. So as I said, and this is just my personal experience too, the existing network of civil society institutions that connect Black people are largely in the city. So when you move to the county, you may get away from some of the negative policing, you may get away from some of the random street violence, but you lose that connection to that cultural capital that actually helps people navigate the world and gives them guidance on how to actually be able to relate to their lived realities in a better way. So this whole push about moving people to the suburbs as some sort of solution to racism, or reflecting some organic true wish amongst Black people, I think it's just really wrong, because if they want to move to the county so bad, why do they come back in the city every Sunday to go to church? They would rather want to have the city reflect the sort of social networks that are reflected in a Black church, but they understand the nature of racism is not allowing the city to do that. What I'm saying is that Baltimore should use things like cannabis tax revenue and other pots of money to just do that. But that isn't the dominant strategy we've used. We've used things like NTI. We've used investments in policing. We've also used investments in things like the arts districts around North Avenue. So the work of the Black Arts District is very intentionally an attempt to counter that trajectory of investment, where if we actually build the conditions for Black civil society to reconnect to itself and have the capacity to address its own problems, I think you can bring some of those Black empty nesters who have too much house and would like to sell their home and downsize and use some of that money to like retire. I think you can bring those folks back to the city, but that's like speaking Hebrew, that's like speaking Aramaic to a lot of folks in city government, because their entire socialization and their entire theory of reviving Baltimore is the exact opposite. Bring in rich people from DC and build the sort of institutions that they want to live with and live through. And I think that not only is it racist, I just think it's objectively wrong. Because if I had enough money to be rich in DC, I can live anywhere while I live in Baltimore, right? So I think that's just a fundamental, again, it's not just a moral argument. It's just practically, I'm asking folks to demonstrate, like, how can they support their theory of economic development and social development when so much of the clear history and theory around institutions and how institutions work proves they're wrong. They focus so much on individuals to ignore that debate about how institutions work. And I'm trying to recenter institutions in that analysis.
Great, Lawrence. I've got a question from Erica. Erica, do you want to ask it live, or do you want me to read it? Oh, we're not hearing. Well, I'll read it off real quick. Erica asked, to enable effective self-determination, do you find there are key soft skill or other strategies to empower and build confidence among affected communities who may be simultaneously working to overcome historic, deeply instilled oppression?
So I appreciate the question. I think it's along the right track. Soft skills is not the frame I would use. I think this is, again, something I imagine Dave talked about this a little bit. Culture is not just song, dance, food. It is the worldview and context by which a people comes to know itself, make sense of itself in the world, and introduce itself to history and humanity. So if you understand that Black people in America, despite the Middle Passage, come from a cultural context of African people, the interventions that we are most in favor of are interventions that use the cultural technologies of African people as the building blocks for human youth community development. So for example, we come out of a community of debaters, and this debate community, we basically just took it over. This debate community was produced essentially as a civilizing mission by well-meaning philanthropic folks who saw if Black kids in the city learn how to debate, maybe they will talk out their issues rather than shoot each other. And Black elders and Black coaches in debate came to these spaces and basically just took them over and used those as spaces to do leadership development, demanding excellence from us, which was not the norm, demanding us to be competitive with white debaters around the country, which was not the norm in our nonprofits, and demanding us to be accountable to debate in a way that reflects the culture and literature base of our community. So I got introduced to Daryl Gates through debate. I got introduced to these analysis of courts through debate, but I debated in a way that reflected my desire to intellectually explore different ways to build ideologies to improve the conditions of the people in my community, which was not what those spaces were built for. And when I'm saying if that's opposed to us having to fight the institution of the Urban Debate League every step of the way, as we just did this sort of revolutionary praxis, we should let the Black elders who really saved our lives in debate, give them the money and the space to build their own institutions at the front end, so they don't have to navigate through the sort of tacit and sometimes very real limitations of existing nonprofit infrastructure. And that's just going to look very different than what people are used to. I mean, people wanted this debate because they thought it would teach us literacy skills. And Black elders said, no, you need to build political advocacy in your debaters. That was scary for a lot of funders for the Urban Debate League. They thought they were just doing literacy. They didn't know they were doing political advocacy. And the division between those two from an African cultural context is non-existent. The ability to build up your intellectual skill set is a reflection of your ability to serve your community and express yourself spiritually in the world in the face of oppression. So building institutions that have that in mind, that are not going to be afraid of the lack of dichotomy between like intellectual skill building and political advocacy, that's what we mean by building institutions that have self-determination and African culture at their foundation, and giving those institutions space to do their work. And that's going to produce the skills that, you know, may not look like what you're used to. You know, a lot of our debaters were not, you know, they didn't sound like the West Wing. They didn't sound like they were, you know, trying to tactfully navigate the middle ground. They were the folks who talked back in class. They weren't always the best students. Sometimes they even became worse students the better they got in debate, because they were more willing to question the teacher and question the BS of the school system. And so you have to be able to redefine what success looks like. Success for me, for a debater, does not look like tacitly accepting the whiteness in their curriculum and getting good grades passively. It may look like a willingness to speak back and get in trouble on behalf of students who they think are getting a hard time. But the evaluations I'm getting from the Casey Foundation don't have a space for that. They have a space for attendance, and they have a space for, did the kid go to college? Did the kid get good grades? So at a fundamental level, we have to reevaluate the institutional infrastructure that these services flow through, because the metrics community are using might just fundamentally be different from what we're using now, so much so that much of what people call success, I call failure, you know? And that's a fundamental schism and disagreement that I think people have not been willing to recognize, that we're asking people to confront and actually address.
All right. Well, thanks again, Lawrence. We're out of time for today, but really appreciate all the insights that you've given us, and thank Yvonne as well for his time a couple weeks ago, and Adam and LBS for participating. Really appreciate it.
We appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
Okay. Take care, Lawrence. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
All right. And the last thing we have is we've got a grants program. It's not a lot, but we have, I just put the link down in the chat window. We have, right now we're starting with 3 $2,000 grants to fund, you know, media, data, and technology inside of your organization. So in addition to those grants, we have software licenses. We put together a short list on that website, but if there's something else that you need that's not on that list, please let us know. We made this process very simple, and the form is, you know, very minimal. We're going to open up the applications today, and we're going to end it in 2 weeks. So November 13th will be the last day for applications, and then we'll make the decisions the week after that and let everybody know November 20th. The rules are on the website, mainly that you're in Baltimore and working on racial justice issues and using media, data, and tech either to start a new program or expand what you already have. So I want to thank everybody for joining us over the last 2 weeks. We really appreciate your time and look forward to staying in touch. I put a link to the Mighty Networks in the chat window as well earlier, but I'll send that around. That's going to be where we put our presentations and our, you know, all of our videos and everything that come out of this. I'll also put my email in the chat window if you have any questions. It's also on the website for the grants. And if you have any questions about the grants, anything at all, let us know. And Elena, it's going to be due November 13th. Yeah. So I'm going to put my email address down here. And if you have any questions at all, please let me know. And we'd love to stay in touch with you. This is just our first stop on the road to equal justice. We're going to be going around the country, but look to be making stops back into the cities, back into Baltimore, hopefully in the near future. And hopefully we'll have more grant funding as well as this goes forward. So thank you very much, and look forward to staying in touch. Take care and have a great day.